And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already. Of course, I am joined tonight by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, it's getting hardcore fall here in Boston.
Yes, it's lovely.
All the rage is the stories about the BU Frankenlab. And this is more, I tweeted about this today, but it's getting out of hand more and more, where these universities just decide to take on. Now they're trying to reroute things outside the government so they don't get caught exploring these deadly strains of things. And BU got caught even going around and creating their own deadly strain of, the good stuff. But this is kind of outrageous, and I anticipate this is going to be a huge story, and we're doing a lot to make sure that it comes out and is on everyone's radar, especially for those students who are going to BU and their parents that are paying all that money to have them in this environment with this bizarro toxin. So that's going to be a big thing. I definitely anticipate we're going to hear a lot more about it. We've just heard the first blush about it, and now, of all things, the NIH is investigating these guys. So that's kind of funny.
It's pretty shocking.
Yeah, think about it. We have a very exciting show for you tonight, which is all about, it's X Series 136, and this is going into the Hot Zone UFO file. This is going to be a particularly interesting one because we're dealing with a topic that I think a lot of facts are rising to the surface about through the program, and that is about the Atlantis period and the automatons and this whole kind of cyborg legacy, we should say, along with AUTEC, which is a very secretive group operating a kind of Area 51 over there off of Andros Island within spitting distance of Bimini. And of course, the Bimini prophecies of Edgar Cayce become important tonight. And I've been opening up things about the Edgar Cayce work. I've often said in relation to Cayce that many things are stressed about his teaching, and they kind of leave a lot off the table about Atlantis because it is controversial. And I do understand it, but, very often we get this kind of caricature of Cayce, helping old ladies across the street and giving kids candy and stuff. And now he did all those things because he was a Sunday school teacher, and he was remarkably good-natured. Which came from that, Kentucky farm boy upbringing. But the work around Atlantis is very edgy, very sci-fi back then. So what are we doing catching up to it now? And the implications of it are really hardcore because, again, he was the most well-documented psychic on record. So I think what he was saying about Atlantean cyborgs, what he was saying about the Two-Eyes Stone, what he was saying about their technology needs to be kind of brought through that refraction of the lens, and where they didn't really get a chance to talk about it because they were too concerned. The organization that runs the Cayce work were probably too concerned that even with all the wild stuff that he had said in his readings, which, all the incredible predictions and all the medical information and the some 900 readings dealing with Atlantis. I think that they just felt, well, we'll leave this one off the table. I remember seeing a director of the organization in a TV interview and saying, well, maybe his mind slipped on that, but he was great on everything else. No, his mind didn't slip on it. It's just that it's so hardcore to bring across. But I think there's a real obligation to study the mystery schools properly to bring the information forward, especially now that in the 21st century we've caught up to it. And this is also the case with the Rudolf Steiner work, which I think has grown in a very, it's interesting. It's been a quiet development in schools, the Waldorf schools, and quiet development in farming, quiet development in culture. But there's a time when the information, for example, about Ahriman and the Eighth Sphere, so it's like we're in this period where these things that really weren't on the radar, even though they were part of, the kind of doctrine or the information left behind by these schools, now this is most appropriate that it's coming out. And there are hints in the literature around these schools that they had left these things. They had vouchsafed them back there. and that we have this opportunity 100 years later to bring this forward. And it's all part of a very futuristic plugin where a century from now, they're going to be getting the things that we're bringing forward. So this is where the automatons and the Atlantean crystal power technology and these things come in to view. And we're going to get a real handle on them tonight. We're also going to be dealing with some Greek shipping magnates. We're going to be dealing also with some very unusual Peenemünde Nazi rocket scientists who seem to have a fascination for Atlantis and left behind some very interesting trails. So it's going to be an explosive one tonight for sure. I wanted to remind everyone that we're going to take questions in the second half of the program tonight. And it's going to be outrageous because I'm going to try to do all the first part in the first hour and a half and then take your questions for the last hour. So we'll see how that goes. The last time I promised that, we went 3.5 hours and it was quite a show. But it's great to be back with you here live. We just did some really interesting interviews with John Warner the fourth. And John is very interesting. In 2021, he came forward on the show and he wanted to put a lot of things on the record, but he, was part of the Mellon family and also the son of Senator John Warner, and who was also Secretary of the Navy as well as the Senator of Virginia. So there was a lot in there, especially since it's been rumored for years that his dad was a part of the magic group that controlled the UFO file. And so John gave us a lot of enlightenment, a lot of interesting things to chew on. And the response from those videos has been remarkable. I've had some very interesting conversations, but I would say that, everyone out there, if you haven't seen it yet, make sure that you get a load of that one. And also, we have some very exciting interviews and documentaries, as well as X-Series episodes coming up for you in November. So sign up for a newsletter. That's a free newsletter. Go to darkjournalist.com to do that. While we're thinking about it, especially if you're new, that's how you're going to catch up on the shows. And the questions, you can ask them now, even if you want to. And Olivia is going to put them together, and we'll have those in the second half of the program. Do you want them in caps? We still do it that way or not?
We still do that. It helps.
So even though it seems like you're shouting, ask the question in caps. Mm-hmm. And how are we doing out there?
Everybody, shockingly, everyone's in a great mood.
With all the things going on in the world. It's the highest inflation, the worst nuclear threat, the biggest threat of cyber terrorism because those Russians want to interfere with the election. Translation, the Democrats are losing and the media is worried. It's pretty interesting. And I would also say that, when it comes to those Senate intelligence groups, they're all anti-Russia across the board. They're always amping up this thing about Russia, of course. And we find ourselves opposed to Russia right now over the Ukraine issue. And the war that's going on there, has cost us $80 billion, has cost them the civilians, thousands of lives, the soldiers and all the rest. So it's an absolutely terrible thing. And the only thing that would be good would be to have an actual peace process to end it. And there's something inside of the Stepford-Biden administration that does not want to do that. They want endless war because they're feeding the defense contractors this, and now they're raising the possibility of nuclear engagement. And it's absurd to raise that because of the nature of these struggles. But coming up here, we are on this anniversary. We're right in that period of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the 60th anniversary of that. And JFK does come up tonight, interestingly enough, in this trip to the Hot Zone that we're doing. But he handled it as president, a very dangerous situation where his Russian counterpart had installed secretly nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba there in the Hot Zone. And they had a hot-headed revolutionary leader, Castro, so the whole thing just seemed completely intolerable. But all of the forces inside the American deep state and the military establishment, national security state, wanted him to go in and just bomb the hell and take over Cuba, which would have set off a nuclear situation. So he kept a clear head and worked very carefully, but he quarantined the island so that nothing could get through, and so that they couldn't add any more weapons or any more setup facilities. And the quarantine turned out to be the one thing that was, showed a lot of strength, but was not so inflammatory as to just getting to a shooting war, which so many forces on either side wanted to do. And interestingly enough, the legacy of President Kennedy after all this was to also create the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which banned all the tests of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, which probably saved, you want to talk about environmental impact. The nuclear tests that they did, I'm sure, really did have a terrible impact. And so these were dramatic steps that Kennedy took, and we need to refocus ourselves around those types of peace processes to get really on the move on this. There's no peace process, and I think the Biden administration should probably fire their Secretary of State, get a new one in there, get a whole peace process, get all the familiar people who do, from both parties who can arrange peace deals. I mean, what's going on here? You can't just have endless wars. Even people like Kissinger are saying, well, I don't think you want a nuclear war with Russia. So we have to realize that civilization hangs in the balance, and we should let everyone know that at the ballot box coming up here in a couple of weeks. And I think that we're already seeing that turn. So it's an important period that we're in, and important to keep in mind that Camelot period that Kennedy came in with. And also remember that he had a very definite policy in regards to space, which is remarkable, which was space was not going to be a war zone. It's not a war fighting zone. It was going to be for scientific research on both sides. And this is also something that we need. Instead, we're hearing, the whole UFO threat piece, and which has been perpetrated by the CIA and the defense contractors. And now they're saying, oh, we need to position ourselves against China in space. So basically guaranteeing themselves power and influence and money, for generations to come, instead of waking up, because if there's no war, there's no money, for the type of interests that serve this deep state. So we have to expose that whole thing, especially since with the lockdowns and everything that happened over the past 2 years, they got to a point of such anti-constitutional martial law style behavior that if that didn't wake up the populace, nothing will. And so we're seeing people are waking up more and more gradually that there's something wrong here. And that, this unelected branch out there, the World Economic Forum, and its connections to global leaders is a real problem, from New Zealand to Canada to the UK. So we need to really kind of wrap ourselves around the moment that we're in and move things back from this precipice. And the first way that you do that is through honest, open conversation about the things that are going on. That's the thing that they're trying to avoid the most, because of the level of censorship anytime you get into speaking about important issues. So, the kind of conversation that we have actually right here in the Ideas Room, in my opinion, is exactly the thing that they fear the most. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 136. We are going deep in the Hot Zone UFO file, and that includes AUTEC, Atlantis, and the Automatons. And this is going to get interesting. I'm going to show some interesting examples from the readings about it and some of the mystery school teachings of dealing with those. Before I jump in, Miss Olivia, you're on.
Well, first up, I want to say Plato always knew it's their birthday today. So a big happy birthday to you. And
Plato always knew what? That would be a question.
He knew everything.
He knew about Atlantis, that's for sure.
You want to follow that up?
Well, this is the starting point, of course. We have an account there of Plato giving us what Atlantis was. And it does not, he's not given to writing stories and making things up. This is a history he's recounting, and he got it from a relative who got it directly from an Egyptian priest who said, look, this thing that you have going on there in Athens goes back a lot further. Try 9,000 years back. So it's 9,000 BC. And if it's interesting, when you look at the CAYCE readings, also, they give us this date of 10,500 BC for the major for Atlantis being submerged and the Atlanteans coming into Egypt and founding the culture with the Sphinx and the Giza Plateau and everything else. And traditional history gives us 2500 BC. So you got 8,000 years of difference there. And the problem is that traditional archaeology was working off, 17th century, 18th century investigations. They just didn't have it. They didn't have the ability to do that. And mentally, they were still working on a paradigm where civilization started, 6,000 years ago. So anyone who's getting into this was blocked. A lot of the traditional people like Graham Hancock and John Anthony West, these were the types of people who were, put in a kind of alternative research circuit. And, traditional archaeology and all these different types of groups, Egypt and everywhere else, pretty much ignored their findings. And we look at that now, there's been a huge shift over time about this. And it's very important now that we have that shift happening for it not to be co-opted. And I'm going to talk about the co-opting aspects tonight because this fits in a lot with what we're seeing in intel circles as well. Because the intel circles co-opting the UFO file, co-opting the contactee movement, co-opting the idea of underwater UFOs, co-opting the idea of underwater cultures, co-opting the idea of our human origins. It's just going to be co-opting and co-opting and astroturfing and astroturfing. I mentioned this actually earlier to Olivia, which was, they had this picture of Joe Rogan, who recently had Ryan Graves on, who's the Navy pilot, who was, run around by the TTSA and Leslie Kean and all these people. And, Navy pilots have been giving us UFO reports since the 40s. So he's not the first, and it's good that he came forward. But also a lot of the things that he was saying pretty much are so connected and locked in with what they did with this whole thing with the TTSA when they try to pretend that, UFOs just started in 2017 through a New York Times story. And they try to highlight Graves. And what I get really when I'm thinking about the work, the things that he's brought forward, it seems to me that, maybe Lockheed Martin or Boeing were doing an advanced test and using him as the, and the people around him, because they're always happening during training exercises. And they're like, we're doing these training exercises and we see these UFOs. Well, maybe connect some dots there. So we have the actual UFO sightings, and then we have this thing. And then I was trying to figure out, well, what are they trying to do with Graves? Because we've seen what they did, in relation to Elizondo, who gave us this false account that he was running this program that dealt with UFOs. And then, we also had Chris Mellon, who was the defense official, and he was the cousin of John Warner, who we had on this program talking about it. And Mellon and Elizondo and TTSA, this whole thing was to create a UFO threat. They had a lot of problems doing that, but they have established through the National Defense Authorization Act these UFO offices, which keep changing their name every 6 months, from AARO to AIMSOG and UAP Task Force, whatever it is. And it's like Project Blue Book Redux 2022, but loaded, just with CIA people, and they're trying to build up this thing, and they've had a real hard time with the threat aspect. And this is very important, and it comes up a lot tonight. But the threat thing is very important for us to get our heads wrapped around, because they haven't been able to pull it off. They're going to resurface it, but it is through conversations like the ones and the type of reporting that we're doing here that they can't get that stuff off the ground, which is why it's very important for people who do reporting in this field around the UFO file, for example, not to play along with intelligence services that are trying to create a threat to help different political figures seize emergency powers. I mean, if you thought the COVID op was something, as I've said over and over again, wait till the UFO op shows up. That's an emergency, right? Lockdown in your house, alien viruses. I mean, they'd have all kinds of things for this. So you can't let that get off the ground, and you can't let the Central Intelligence Agency become the authority. Now, here's how that happens. In a society like the one we have, everything comes through the media, as we know. So when you have people like Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan and all these people who tend to do, pretty decent reports on things, to one degree or another. I mean, it's it's still a superficial layer, but it's better than CNN or something like that. However, what they're doing with the UFO file is a big problem because they're inviting on spooks, CIA people who are saying, well, I'm a contactee and I'm going to give you information, but you're a CIA, you're under CIA orders, basically. And this is where they're getting the majority of their information. Gary Nolan, for example, going on Tucker Carlson being like, boy, we really have to get a handle. I don't understand how we don't understand this UFO threat. And Gary Nolan being like, well, it's a big threat out there. This is a CIA person under orders to create a UFO threat through the media so they can create these offices, et cetera, et cetera. So people like Tucker and people like Joe and Megyn Kelly and all these others, if they're going to report on the UFO thing, then they have to balance it out with some actual real researchers who are not in cahoots with the Central Intelligence Agency. So you have a lot of problems there. And I'm going to show how the person I was mentioning, Graves, who was the Navy pilot, now he's locked in with all of these aerospace companies, and they've made him part of the chair of this thing. Those are the very defense companies that are going to benefit from the rollout of this threat. So, these things have to be plugged in a much better way, to kind of sit there and go like, oh, wow, you saw something during a training exercise. Well, you're going to have to take it from, do you have instructions from the Central Intelligence Agency? Have they told you that it's okay to talk about these things? And are they actually, encouraging you to do that? That's one question. The next question is, for some of the counterintelligence people that they have coming out, like Elizondo and Millen and all the rest, if you were given orders by the CIA or for the intelligence service that you're working for, since counterintelligence, very often consists of you misleading a foreign country, to give them a counter narrative, a counter story. If you were instructed to do that and come out with this fake story, would you do it since you were under orders? These are the types of questions these people need. They don't need the wow fests of people like Rogan and people in the media giving them this entree. So I think it's a big problem there, especially if that starts to become the gateway, because you're looking at a kind of astroturfing level, which is problematic. Because what happens is there was this new promotion actually of Rogan. I'm going to spend a couple minutes on this. And it was a big poster, and behind him was a picture of Bigfoot, and in front of him was a gray alien. And I thought, well, this show.
Were those the only two images?
Those were the only two images.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the whole idea being that, the entire kind of alternative spectrum of things is now supposedly wrapped up in this one show by Spotify, paying this guy $300 million who's a comedian, That type of astroturfing, it's fine if it's understood as a kind of a superficial level of things. But I also was saying to myself, it's interesting because what they've done is they've identified the great interest around alternative subjects, and that we haven't been getting the truth for years around these subjects, especially on the UFO file thing. Since the CIA was created in 1947, you're talking 75 years of obfuscation. And now they have this kind of come to Jesus version with people like, very high level CIA people who have retired and now said, oh, I'm a contactee. And so therefore, listen to all my stories about UFOs. So we have to get on a different level with this and look at the astroturfing part and be able to identify it as that's going after market share. That's a lot different than getting into the deeper reports and examining the UFO file to get to the bottom of that truth. And when you see, we've got a lot of UFO researchers who play along with that and play along with the UFO threat and the CIA presence in it and saying, oh, well, the CIA is opening up. Look, you don't understand, if you work in the UFO field and you don't understand that the UFO piece is the biggest secret in the Central Intelligence Agency, and that there are groups working inside of aerospace companies and intelligence services to keep that truth away from the public and have no interest in disclosure for the public, then you probably should get out of the business because you're just going to end up being a tool pansy for the CIA. And we've seen it happen, and we've seen it happen even to generally good researchers. But there's a weird wave of that. And the new thing now, they're coming in on the science angle because the threat angle got a little mangled by people like Elizondo. So now they have Avi Loeb, but he stations all the people in the Galileo project as intelligence CIA people. So you have a lot of problems, and he's doing that research right over here at Harvard. So, this is something that's just active and in the air. And I mentioned in the previous show that he was talking about how the head of the UAP task force dropped by his house in the morning. I mean, the UAP task force is in DC. So, this guy's coming up here and just dropping in on him. I mean, there's a lot of weird things. Like, are you the head of your own program? Is that an intelligence official telling you what to do? So, we're looking at strange things when it comes to pharmaceutical pressure on the political scene. We've seen what politicians did with that. And we're looking at it with aerospace companies. And, I could almost call this the aerospace mafia from the research that I've done. It does not get the attention that it deserves. And we're going to bring a lot of that forward here tonight. There's the major presence of a military contractor in the Bahamas in this story tonight as well. So that's going to get interesting. But for me, I really want to put the message out there and on the record that we've got a lot of astroturfing going on the UFO file. And here's the thing. The questions should be, when you're dealing with these people, what are your relationship to the intelligence agencies? 1. 2, are you engaged in a counterintelligence program? And 3, if you claim that you're no longer working for the government, which we've seen a lot of these guys have lied about that. Elizondo in particular, they always said ex-Pentagon, ex-Pentagon. He was working for the government the whole time and still is. So if somebody says, well, I got out of there and I'm a whistleblower or whatever, and say, are you still contracting for the government, even if you don't work for them full time? These are the types of answers that we need, not the kind of like stuff that we've got from people like George Knapp and stuff, embracing these guys. So, we have to move on to a new level with this, a really hardcore investigative journalist level. And investigative journalism at times can be adversarial journalism. It's not personal. It never can be. But, I've pointed this out before. If you were dealing with a CEO who's like dumping nuclear waste in a river, that's not going to be, you're not going to go hang out at the gym with them or have chummy podcasts. You're going to get to the point. And that's what we need a lot more of. And that's hopefully what we're bringing you here with Dark Journalism. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight on some of the fluff that we've seen out there. And we're changing the tone around these things to get to the real bottom line. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. You can ask those questions now. I have quite a presentation for you here in X Series episode 136. And this is a AAA. We've got Automatons, Atlantis, and AUTEC, all in the Hot Zone UFO file. So this is going to be maybe one of those major connecting the dots episodes. Everyone from Albert Einstein to Colonel Sanders shows up in this. So you're going to want to, I'm probably going to have to do a part 2 on this one just by the nature of it. Before I jump in, you're up.
Walter Bosley is out in the ideas room tonight. And he said the Patriot Act was practice ground for the threat narrative scam.
Well, that's really true. And it's really interesting too about the development of the Patriot Act, because you have the 9/11 incident happens and all the things around it. And then you've got Dick Cheney retreating into a mountain retreat and coming out with the Patriot Act. This thing was already well designed beforehand, of course. But when we look at Cheney and his connection to the continuity of government program, that's somebody who we can see, is very close. Very often it's hard to see who actually is involved with the deep state. There's just a lot of front people. And, people, it's too easy, I think, to jump to conclusions. Cheney, however, is a direct link to that hidden system, in my opinion, and his work with continuity of government through the 80s. and as a CEO of Halliburton. This is somebody who wasn't even really in government. Along with Rumsfeld, he was a CEO of a private company. They called them back to do this. And so I find this very interesting. But the events around what they did with 9/11 and how that pertains to how the UFO threat lays out, it's very interesting, along with the fact that the domestic terror bill lays out terms for regular citizens that sound very much like what they laid out for Muslim extremists after 9/11, stripping away certain types of constitutional privileges for them. So it's sort of like everyone has become Al-Qaeda when we consider this. And that's very, very disconcerting. But that layover, I think 9/11 is becoming so potent for us at this period to think about. And all right, so let's start off with this. It's a very interesting letter.
Can I just throw this one thing in there?
Yeah.
Okay. Karen Carpenter just added this. Quantum of Conscience, Graduated Animal Farm is a great explanation of astroturfing and limited hangouts. As we learn more, we jump the fence, but only to a larger pen over and over and over again.
Well, you reminded me of Animal Farm, the book by George Orwell, which is brilliant and very strange fairy tale there about totalitarian takeover. And it had a very important impact on me. I read that when I was 8. And I think it slipped in. Someone thought it was a children's book. And but I got a kind of an early feeling for what was going on there. But it is interesting. I think that we're at a point where we need to develop a protocol on the ground for these things that are coming at us through the media and coming at us from the government and from marketing sources, as well as perception management coming out of the intel agencies. That's a lot, and it's all hitting at once, and it's hitting with technology that we haven't had before, so the level of entrainment goes up dramatically. On our side, there are more people waking up as well, and we also have the experience of having had some great researchers. Some have passed into the great beyond. I was recalling my great conversations with Jim Mars the other day. There's a lot of people who have lived and died figuring these things out and have left an incredible legacy. Jim Keith is another one. And thank God we have the good researchers that we still have with us. So it makes a huge difference. And I know somebody mentioned Mary Farrell out there. There is a story floating around, and I'll put this in before I start. And the Mary Farrell Foundation is the one that's kept all the JFK records really since the beginning. And she's the one who developed a real database for people to go to and search for the different answers and the players involved in the government obfuscation of the Kennedy case. Now, the JFK records were slated to come out October 26, 2017 by law, and they didn't. And so presidents have let out bits and pieces. We've talked about the Trump controversy where he talked with Judge Napolitano behind the scenes and said, I've seen what's in there, and you couldn't, there's no way I could let that out. So it obviously relates to a very deep, deep secret. And it's my opinion that Robert Kennedy was able to leave some kind of a booby trap in there so that if the CIA just tried to eliminate that knowledge, it was going to set off a number of alarm bells. So they weren't able to do it. So their idea was, we'll just sit on it. No one will ever see it. So year after year, this thing comes up. Now, what happened was the Mary Farrell Foundation is suing the Biden administration for the records, which legally they're entitled to get. And I want to put this on the record. The main records that they don't want to let out have to do with George Joannides, who no one even knew existed. And he was the person who was a psychological operations guy. And he created the whole Oswald project and all the rest of it. And then he shows up later controlling the investigations. And then he shows up finally getting a medal, career service medal from the CIA Lifetime Achievement. They never say what it's for, of course, for that special work he was doing. But the person who gives it to him is Admiral Bobby Inman. And the clash there of Inman, who, you know, is this Navy admiral and head of the NSA and deputy CIA director. I mean, just real operator, and still with us. I mean, I think 90 years old now. But Inman in the late 80s came out and said, not only do we know and have examined UFOs, we know who's operating them. That's a pretty high level figure to make a statement like that. And he won't talk about it now. You know, I've seen people try to get him into conversations, and he'll show up and he'll talk about the good old Navy days, but he will not say anything about the UFO file of merit. So this is very important, I think. It's those Joannidis records, which were not even part of the haul that Congress demanded the CIA give to the public because they didn't even know they existed. So that, I think, is significant. The other is the Garrison records. And the Garrison records, through his investigation in the 1960s, ran directly into the aerospace wing. And that gets us into the real players of DISC, the Defense Industrial Security Command, who were behind the assassination, the X-Protect group. And so they can't let the Garrison records out. They can't let the Joannidis records out, because in that crisscross, you would get the aerospace companies from the military industrial complex working with the intelligence agencies remove the president. Now, what you will get with this lawsuit, though, is very interesting. One of the guys who blocked the original lawsuit for records about Joannidis, that a journalist, and Peter Dale Scott was part of this lawsuit. But the person who blocked it was Kavanaugh, Judge Kavanaugh, who's on the Supreme Court now and is one of the guys that Trump put up there as a judge candidate. And it's pretty interesting because one of his last duties before he hopped on to the Supreme Court was to deny the records of Joannidis and the CIA to the journalists and the other people who had brought the case. So, you know, we're looking at it. There's a high stakes game going on with those records. And does it relate to what we've seen at Mar-a-Lago? Very, very well could be indeed. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Great to have so many of you here with us tonight. And there's going to be a lot of threads here tonight. Let's get to some of them here right off the bat. I want to talk about these automatons. I'm going to start this a little bit differently. I'm going to do the automatons first. So in the CAYCE readings, of which there's close to 1,000 that deal with Atlantis, there are references to a group of Atlanteans that were created and that they brought with them when they went into Egypt after Atlantis was submerged. And he has various names for them, CAYCE does. Sometimes he refers to them as things, sometimes as the untouchables, and sometimes as, more often than not, automatons. And what we have with that reference, when we think about the period that CAYCE is in, although his language can be very futuristic, if he's really talking in the 20s and 30s about this, the automatons is a reference to what they called robots in those days, just before the term robot became popular. And there were a whole series of different types of automatons that were in development. Some of them answered phones, you know, some of the earliest sort of computer artificial intelligence that we had. And it's quite interesting to look at that period and to look at all the science fiction and H.G. Wells and all that sort of thing, and then to place it against the context of CAYCE giving these retrocognitive readings on Atlantis. So here he is in his consciousness going back and viewing these Akashic records of this period of time. And over again, almost like he has that incredible sight, things that he said in those readings have come to be known as absolutely true. For example, in one of the readings, he said, you know, at a certain point, the Nile emptied into the Atlantic Ocean. And everyone thought, well, that was ridiculous. But they found out through satellite imagery that a long, long time ago, that this is actually true. So these types of things and the types of vision that he had when he went into these trance states, you know, go beyond so much of what we understand as ordinary cognitive abilities, but CAYCE proved it. And a number of programs like remote viewing and all the rest of it have shown this, and it's shown the government interest in studying this. Of course, the deeper programs that they don't talk about and the groups of psychics that they work with, you know, that gets us into a whole other area. But we know on the record, we have the remote viewing program, which, you know, I've had conversations with Russell Targ before, and he, you know, him going back through how they used it. You know, they used it to get, for example, ambassadors who were kidnapped away and save them. You know, I mean, they were using it in very high intensity situations, the Patty Hearst case and all these types of things around that period, 70s and 80s. So we know how much they relied upon it. But then you know, it went into the deeper black world of the CIA, and we don't know what they continued to do with it, but we know people later, 20 some odd years later, the program, things about the program came out. So individuals like CAYCE would have been incredible to have for programs like that. They would have loved to have someone like that. Fortunately, we got CAYCE and the deep state didn't. CAYCE was a photographer, and that's what he did for a living. And the psychic part kept coming back. You know, his wife got tuberculosis and he had to give her readings, psychic readings, to help her and do that psychic diagnosis. And, you know, over and over again, there are all these affidavits from people who were helped by the CAYCE work. And he's one of the most well-documented psychics in history, if not the most well-documented. There's a number of predictions that he made about the Depression, the JFK assassination, World War II. So he saw these things coming, no question about it. There's a whole series of earth changes readings that he gave about how there's going to be a gradual earth shifting and land is going to rise. Remember, this is a theme in the mystery schools off the east coast of America. And there's also going to be a breakup of land throughout Europe, and there's going to be a big breakup of land in the western part of the United States and submersion of major states like California. So all of these things come into the CAYCE legacy, but I think one of the most remarkable things that he gave us are these readings about a futuristic society that we already created back in Atlantis. And the things that he goes into such detail about how that culture dispersed. You know, we have a number of Atlantis experts around, and people have really studied it. And I've done, you know, I had the privilege of having done interviews with guys like Graham Hancock and really gotten their take on the research that they've done on it. And these are people who've taken the time and really spent their lives figuring it out. And they're convinced that there was a mother culture that was antecedent to all of the major ancient cultures that we are familiar with, like the Incas, like the Egyptians, etc. So we've covered Atlantis in this program extensively because it's important for where things are headed, because we're looking at a kind of a cycle that's come around again. Because in fact, these Atlanteans in their period of time destroyed themselves. And part of that destruction is still left over in places like the Bermuda Triangle, for example. And so there's something that occurs, an effect that takes place around those areas. I've termed it apotheum. And the apotheum is also something that we see show up in the UFO sightings. You know, people lose time, they go through walls when they're abducted, and the laws of physics fail to be activated normally. So when CAYCE's going back and he's looking at what the Atlanteans had done, he sees them setting off what he called these power stations. And they're tuned too high, and they basically cause a gigantic EMP style event through these two eye stones. And in that destruction, we get the legends of, oh, they were destroyed in a day and a night, and there were cataclysms and all the rest. And everyone thinks, well, it was a comet and it destroyed, you know, some place that was there. And I'm sure that we've had that activity. There's great evidence for it. However, the idea of an ancient culture that was high tech that destroyed itself accounts a lot for this story as well, and rings very much true in the civilization that we're in now, because there's too many interesting things that they have to say back there that sound like there was a high-tech culture going on. And let me tell you, it had nothing to do with ancient aliens, although I'm sure they were buzzing in and out. So the Atlanteans, according to CAYCE, had this advanced civilization. And sometimes when you look at information around CAYCE, people will concentrate on like, oh, the Atlanteans were basically like an advanced primitive tribe. It's like a culture that we lost, who would basically be like the Incas or something. No, those cultures were advanced, but they came from a much more advanced legacy. And they, in their own writings, talk about themselves as a legacy culture. So we're looking at something that was a lot more advanced that was back there. So we're not looking for a culture that was just something that was like the other cultures and just happened to be around, like a lost tribe, which is interesting enough. But the Atlanteans were in a position of, they were a superpower, and the energies that they tapped into metaphysically, atomically, and all the rest of it were very advanced. And in my opinion, from looking at the mystery school work, we haven't caught up to what they were doing yet with all our advances and all the rest. So in the process, there were two groups that split off. The Emilius group was the group that wanted to use all of the technology that they had for higher spiritual purposes. And he talks about them in a very interesting fashion as children of the law of one. And, they have a kind of devotional quality that they've grown with the technology, and they've made Atlantis kind of an Eden. And their stronghold is a place called Poseidia, which is there in the Bahamas. And the other group, the Sons of Belial, are, have decided to use the same technology for aggressive purposes on the physical plane, and they don't care about the spiritual aspect of it. They tap into kind of a black magic type vibe with it. So you have the split there. It's like a very good and evil type situation. So the group, the Belial group, the way CAYCE sees them with their scientists, develop this interbreeding program where it's a program of developing these cyborg slaves. And sometimes they mix them in with nature. Sometimes they mix them with animals. Sometimes they mix them with different elements, trees, rocks, and they're creating this cyborg. And that cyborg becomes the automaton, and that creates a problem where they start to have all of these slaves doing things for them, and their own character suffers because they're kind of living the life of Riley, and they're in this luxury state of mind. And what's happening is, in that phase of humanity, there are still souls incarnating into these things because they're mixing. This is the nature of the period of time that we're talking about. We weren't so closely knit in matter as we are now. So this is what CAYCE is giving us about what these scientists did. They created monstrosities. But they also had a slave force built up this way. And so when they come in after the inundations and earthquakes destroy central Atlantis and the three islands, they come into Egypt, a group of them. And part of the problem CAYCE is talking about when he's looking back at this period is that they come in with all of these automatons. And this, Egypt already has a native population. It already has a number of things, and these Atlanteans are advanced. So we're coming into this situation. 10,500 BC is the period that he's talking about. Now, I'm going to go into some of the readings, what he had to say about what these things were, to give us an idea about it, and then start to reflect on how this relates to procedures that we are involved in right now: artificial intelligence, cloning, putting various devices for tracking people, and the chip and all the rest, the mark of the beast. All of these things, we're in the period, and it's like looking at ourselves in a mirror from a period that's been forgotten, which is very dangerous. So if we can arouse that memory deep in our own subconscious, we might have a powerful tool for the period that we're in. And that's what I think is the intent behind the CAYCE work and so much of the Mystery School legacy that's been left behind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series episode 136. We're going deep tonight on CAYCE's vision of Atlantis and the automatons, and also the strange Hot Zone UFO file, how this all relates to the period that we're in and the deep, deep secrecy going on in that hot zone area. And I will get into what the hot zone is. Regular viewers know what I'm referring to there, but for the newer viewers, I'm also going to just give us a quick overview before I go any further. Miss Olivia.
Walter Bosley says, fact, the word robot comes from the Russian verb to work. And Jay Vandervest says transhumans equal automatons. So that's what we're talking about here. I think now that the science is catching up with the CAYCE readings, you know, I used to think like a half man, half tree, and sort of a mythic, you know,
yes,
old-fashioned version. You know, it's kind of groovy. But now I understand that you can actually take genes, like chromosomes, right, out of one species and add it into the DNA of another.
Yes.
Right. And that could be what CAYCE is referring to.
Yeah.
Instead of things like centaurs and things like that.
Yes. He does talk about the, you know, the kind of mythical Greek beings as if they actually had them. So these are the mixtures in that DNA lab of history. And part of the work of the Temple Beautiful in Egypt is, he describes it kind of like a hospital where they work on them. So I'm going to go to the readings for that, but that's an excellent point.
I just wanted to add about those hospitals, right?
Yes.
Now it all makes much more sense of how the kind of intensive work you would need to do to repair DNA.
Yes.
You know, to detoxify the tissues.
Well, and think about it. I mean, we're talking, you know, you could have a medical practice for that, but think about the level on which a mystery school would work on the chromosome level of somebody spiritually. That gets into energy healing and all these types of things. So it starts to open things up on a few levels. And one of the things that the priest Rata was involved in, and Rata comes up a couple of times tonight, is he was working on the endocrine systems of these cyborgs so that, you know, they could move forward and be fully human, and that their offspring would be human and wouldn't have this Atlantean mixture piece associated with it. So watching for these terms about mixture, pollution, and all the rest when he's speaking about them is very interesting, because we start to wonder what took place and how much of that is responsible also for things going to the level that they did. Here's a couple of readings. The readings are in the 281 series of the CAYCE readings, and they're available there at the ARE. If you're a member of the ARE, the readings are available to you, but a lot of these readings are in Edgar CAYCE on Atlantis or Mysteries of Atlantis Revisited, which were written by Edgar Evans CAYCE, his son, who I was lucky enough to meet. And this is a guy who at 90 years old looked like 30 years younger. So he was obviously following the readings. But he was an engineer. And according to CAYCE, he'd had a past life in Atlantis as somebody who was involved in doing this stuff. He was one of the kind of the bad scientists. So he came back this time to set the record straight. And it's interesting because in those readings, he said, you know, a lot of the people in Atlantis called him the dreaded one, because, you know, he would be like the guy who created the hydrogen bomb and then somebody used it.
And it's never been revealed exactly what he did to earn that title, right?
True. Yeah. I would say that, you know, it's remarkable because in the CAYCE cosmology, we have so many lives and we can have incredible lives. in one of Casey's lives, he was Ra-Ta the priest in Egypt who unified the Atlanteans with the Egyptian culture and got the high spiritual Atlanteans to place the Hall of Records in Egypt, this kind of thing. But, Casey also recounted lives where one of them was as John Bainbridge. And John Bainbridge was kind of like a wastrel, a scoundrel. And he was a soldier who still had psychic ability and used it for things like, cheating at gambling and stuff. So there's a range that takes place there that I find quite fascinating. And I'm sure the same is true with Edgar Evans. There's a growth in that reincarnation process. Now, some people can take reincarnation or leave it, but it's a major tenet in the mystery schools. This is how, they play things out. It didn't enter into the popular lexicon of speaking about these things until the Theosophical Society got in there, and anthroposophy got in there and started talking about these things. This is part of what was necessary to bring forward from the mystery schools. And it's one of those things that, Steiner talks about the mystery school wars, where they were completely at odds with each other about what to let out in this incredible scientific materialism burst that took place in the 19th century. And so there were a lot of trade-offs. But there's a lot of weird things that happen while they're trying to let information out, like the spiritualism craze. And if you really look at it, there's an explosion of interest around the mid 19th century in this, which just seems to be totally lagging before. Where did this come from? And this, according to Steiner, is that mystery school knowledge rising to the surface. Okay, here's some readings, just a couple of quick snippets from this Edgar Cayce 281 series. Okay, the question is, what is meant by automatons who labored in that experience? Were they individual souls developing, or was it spiritual evolution? The answer, both and neither. They were the offspring of the sons of God with the daughters of men, or vice versa. So there's one very interesting passage about the sons of God and the daughters of men producing giants in the Bible. Then if you go deeper, you're going to find that there's a whole range of discussion in the book of Enoch about these watchers and their role in creating the early civilizations. And the watchers come down from heaven. Now, a lot of people would think these are aliens or whatever, but I want you to think about it more of these as advanced spiritual beings who are becoming more and more materialized by interacting with us. And we also, humanity is on a higher level. We're not so materialistic as we are now. So this is a great window back into time. So there's stories there throughout the book of Enoch about the same type of thing. There's some mixture of this group with, this kind of supernatural group with regular humanity that was, in evolutionary stages. And that creates a different group, and that group becomes a big problem. And then basically the flood is sent to wipe out that group. So, we start to get a handle on the things. We want to keep some of that piece in mind. And all right, so he's talking about how in the Egyptian temples, they actually changed these beings. So it's the beings that had been altered by the Atlanteans back into normal people. And it says, please give an explanation insofar as our understanding permits of the methods and techniques used at the time in order to cleanse the physical bodies of their animal characteristics and other undesirable conditions. And the answer is the passage of individuals, to be sure, by choice, through the experiences in the Temple Beautiful and Temple of Sacrifice. And the sacrifice, again, in this case, what they have to do, it's a whole process that's set up about, they sacrifice their ego. It's not about human sacrifice. And so he says, it would be much in the same way as hospitalization or hospital in the present day, when there have been antagonistic conditions within the physical body, such as to produce tumors and such. Magnify this into the disturbances which were indicated or illustrated in conditions where there was the body or figure of the horse or the head of the horse with the body of a man, or where there were various conditions indicated in the expressions by the pushing of spirit into physical matter until it became influenced by or subject to same. That's a direct correlation there about mixing animals with humans. That's one level of these things. Then he goes, such influences we see in the present manifested as habits or habit-forming conditions. This is the leftover, the extreme habits, and people have very deep alcohol or drug dependencies and things of this nature. They are leftovers from some of this activity. Then there are or were the needs or attempts to operate, as well as to adhere to diets and activities to change the nature of the individuals and their offspring, as well as themselves. So they might bring forth that which was keeping with a pattern of those influences in which their souls or spirits were the ideal of seeking light. Now, part of the battle that took place between the Amelia's group and the Belial group is that once they had created all these cyborgs and mixtures, and they had things set. These were the workers in the field. This is very much what kind of like the World Economic Forum wants to do with creating all these robots now, and growing an ear on a mouse, a human ear on a mouse. It's the same thread, and I'm going to show you exactly how close that thread is. But they had it great because they had all these slaves, slave armies and all the rest. So they didn't want to change this situation at all. So it gets a little bit deeper as he's talking about it. He says, well, as might be termed in the presence, some indicated that the priest alone, Rata, would be a match for those activities for some of the stronger or more forward Atlanteans. So they're saying, Rata is supernatural himself, and he has, a big psychic background, psychic connection. And Rata comes in as an unusual figure in the story as well. And he is a daughter of, he's the offspring of a daughter of Zu, Z-U, this is in the readings, with no earthly father. So there's something instantly supernatural about him. We don't know. There's no explanation because nobody asked Casey, what does that mean? But there's something unusual about Rata. So the Egyptians who are being flooded by the Atlanteans coming in are thinking to themselves, what's going on here? What are we going to do? Let's get Rata, basically, because, just like their black magicians and their weird DNA experience, this guy might be somebody who can kind of face off against them. So he's saying, as might be termed in the present, some indicated that the priest alone, Rata, would be a match for the activities of some of the stronger or more forward Atlanteans, for they had brought with them many things. Okay, the things, and that's capitalized always, which means it's the way he says it. It's the emphasis that these are the things that he's talking about. So, we have on one hand the kind of Island of Dr. Moreau type images, of just thinking about those human animal mixtures. And then we also think of like hardcore cyborg machine human mix. And then he said, many of the things, the individuals or entities that were without purpose or merely automatons to labor or act for the leaders in the various spheres of activity. And as the natives found, such beings were being classified or judged to be such as many of the natives of the land. Interestingly enough, there's a conversation I had with Catherine Fitz that they were trying to give robots citizens' rights. So robot citizen. This is exactly what he's talking about here. When the Atlanteans come in, they want to give the rights, basically. They want the natives to be classified like these slaves. Because the Atlanteans are basically a ruler type and they feel themselves far superior and they're coming out of a superior culture. One of the interesting things about this whole thing about making robot citizens and giving them all the rights is that, Fitz was saying, well, if you developed a whole new kind of background for, a bureaucracy for dealing with cyborg rights, and automation robot rights, it would take years basically. But if you can take genders and create gender X, for example, which is part of this X steganography, and confuse the issue to a degree far beyond what we would see in normal life. For example, and this question gets very deep when we get into the classification of genders and all the things that they've been trying to roll out. Part of this gender X thing is to create something which doesn't have to have a gender, but still has all of these different rights and has all these different categorizations. They want to basically use that to parlay it to create a kind of robot citizenry. That's what it's kind of like a trial balloon to do. And it's experimentation with humanity on a level that has not been seen. So, except probably back in ancient Atlantis. So when we see and hear about these things on the level that they're talking about, and I'm not talking about, somebody wanting to change their gender and things of this nature. I'm talking about the mass push from above, from a small kind of corporate cabal coming down and laying this out and saying, you're this gender, you're that gender, I'm going to give you a gender blocker and all the rest of it. This is the same type of scientific experimentation and that kind of Frankenstein monster thing. They're just as likely to create scenarios with people where they branch them off so far from humanity that there's no way back. And they're just as likely, after 10 years of doing this to say, well, you know what, those people are no longer human. So we have to be careful the types of setups that they're bringing in now when we think about this and consider it. All right, a couple more things from these readings giving us a little more about the period. Hence, there were overtures made to the ruler, the king of Egypt, and to those in authority that the priest, Rata, be recalled because they had placed him in exile. That's a long story. So what we get is that the nature of the situation in that period is that the Atlanteans had taken over Egypt, and that Rata comes in and he comes back and he says, basically to the Atlanteans, if you can kind of follow after the Amelius teachings, then, the native cultures can deal with you. But if you continue this, it's going to be civil war. So he's talking about these things and he's giving this. Now, the Amelius piece, I want to give just a few kind of key precepts about Amelius. And the sons of God in this period, because Amelius is something that's exclusive to the CAYCE readings. Now, I find it very interesting that when we go into anthroposophy and we go into Rudolf Steiner's work, that he brings forward Ahriman, which is something that's only briefly mentioned in Theosophy. So he uses as his understanding of evil, he gives us that wave of the Ahrimanic forces coming in and describes that. And Ahriman comes through that Persian mythology. But here's CAYCE coming up with a name that does not appear in any of the history texts relating to a major historical holy figure, Amelius. So, the name shows up at times, but it not on the level of what he's attributing to it. So this Amelius and what CAYCE is giving us about it is very unique to the readings, in my opinion. So the question comes up, explain the sons of God, daughters of men, sons of man. Here's the answer. This too has been given again and again, as has been indicated through these other associations, the influences of those souls that sought material expression. They were pushed into thought forms in the earth, and owing to the earth's relative position with the activities in this particular sphere of activity in the universe, it was chosen as the place for expression. Think universe, eternity, time, space. What do these mean to the finite mind? More often than otherwise, they are just names. And then I'm skipping ahead. Then these souls who entered through a channel made by God, not by thought, not by desire, were the sons of God, the daughters of God. The daughters of men, the sons of men, then, were those who became the channels through which lust knew its activity. This is very interesting. What we're finding out in this period is that there's two sets of beings early on. And so the Belial group is watching how the Emilius group can project other beings. But they want to learn how to do that as well. And what's happening is we have, two totally different sets of humanity. And they're so often spoken about in the early CAYCE readings about when he's going back into somebody's past life, he'll say they were in Atlantis before Adam. So we're talking about a different set of humanity there. And then Adam becomes kind of the outcome of all this. And this is what CAYCE is getting at with the Emilius piece, because Emilius is the one who separates the sexes. So early on, those are androgynous. And so when Emilius comes in, he says, he gives that impulse for the separating of the sexes. So he is kind of a remarkable, holy and supernatural figure who's giving the inspiration, the impulse for this. That's our first indication that there's something very special going on with the Emilius part of the story. A little more on Emilius, and then we're going to move into how this relates to the Hot Zone. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is the X series 136. We're going Atlantis, Emilius, and the Automatons. Here we go. In the developments of that time, as would be termed in the present day, of preparing those things that would pertain to what would be termed the aerial age or the electrical age. He's talking about the advent of technology here. And supplying when the modes and manners of transportation of those materials about same that did not pertain to themselves bodily, for of themselves was transposed, rather by that ability lying within each to be transposed in thought as in bodies. In these things did Emilius see the beginning of the abilities and those of his own age, era, or period, not only to be able to build that as able to transpose or build up the elements about them, but to transpose them bodily from one portion of the universe to the other. This takes us to a very deep level. So what he's saying is that with their consciousness, they can go anywhere. But now Emilius is also saying you can take something, a device here on Earth, and go anywhere with it physically. So there's the suggestion here that this is where the advanced aspects of the Atlanteans come in, because this is technologically speaking what he's getting at. He's saying they can go anywhere in the universe physically with actual devices. But he's also saying that they can go anywhere with their consciousness. And so the nature of humanity then is in a different state. It's solidifying here. And as it solidifies here, then the solutions are coming up technologically. We're going to do things technologically. And when we reach that spot in consciousness, this is different, because Emilius can already travel. He's going through the realms, and he can travel with his consciousness to any planet or whatever it happens to be. This is a very important piece in the CAYCE readings, and it's very advanced, and it's an erudite concept to come through the way that it does, because it suggests basically that the high technology in Atlantis, the impulse, came from the fact that they were so advanced on a consciousness level. And then it wasn't about creating technology just for convenience. It certainly became convenient. But that the idea was, I can, for a spiritual purpose, create a high technology. So that separates them from everyone else in that period, because they are, the group that opposes them sees the advances that they're making only in terms of how they can, dominate their neighbors. So this is very important, because we see this all the time. We're seeing it even in our own war-torn world. And I was reading a very interesting essay from General David Shoup, who was a JFK general. He was somebody who was going to install in the Central Intelligence Agency. And I was reading about him and the things that he was doing and talking, and he really objected to our activity during the Cold War going into Vietnam. He objected to the idea of the Bay of Pigs, so there were people in that establishment who were very much against this militaristic approach that we took. Kennedy, and they call him Kennedy's favorite general, and you can only imagine what would have happened had he installed him as the CIA director. This must have been part of the reason for getting Kennedy out of there. But Shoup, after he retires immediately when Kennedy is assassinated, realizing what's taken place. And he goes out to give basically anti-war speeches, talking about, you know, the nature of our involvement in these different countries and what it's about and what it's for. This is an old problem that we have about using intense militarization to achieve aims that are serving a few, devastating others, and making slaves out of the great majority. So we're looking there at a refracted image of ourselves in this mirror once again. And I want us to keep that in mind as we go forward, looking at the CAYCE readings on this period, that this strain, this thread is with us over and over again. And just when we think, oh, you know, the Cold War ended, well, everything will be hunky-dory, they created the War on Terror. And just when we, you know, got through that after a decade, they create the financial debacle, coup d'etat, and then they create control through medical systems. And the UFO threat is also, a major piece of this. They could basically militarize the whole world, all the satellites, space, and everything else against this enemy that they're creating. So, you know, this is the nature of how important I think the work is that they left behind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, going deep here on CAYCE's work into the heart of the Atlantean setup. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program, as I mentioned. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia.
Karen Carpenter has reminded us that Sophia the robot was granted citizenship, which was a big step.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't think that people got spooked enough by that one. You know, you hear so much about fear porn, and it's true. Over and over again, we see, you know, a number of different issues being exploited for fear purposes. But that's one that really like slipped by without people being afraid enough.
They underplayed it, right?
Yes.
So, you know,
yes,
it set a precedent and they didn't want people to react to it.
Absolutely true. Since you mentioned robots, though, I've got some very, very special automatons for us to check out. This is going to be interesting, actually. Remember now the story that I laid out. It's in Virginia Giuffre's testimony about how Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell wanted her to seduce this MIT scientist named Marvin Minsky, and how Marvin Minsky was very connected to the whole Atlantis story through his best friend, Margaret Adams, or Margaret Sanders, who was the Colonel Sanders' daughter, and was engaged in a heavy-duty program to find Atlantis in the Bahamas. Well, Marvin was also the basically founder of the AI aspect at MIT, and he had been working to create this whole cyborg intelligence. And he has an incredible biography, and perhaps we can do a separate show on him. I've covered him extensively. But what I want us to keep in mind is this development of the thing, the cyborg, the automaton. This is something that's very old, but it is the absolute sort of, it's the gem in the crown for the elites around this, because this is really what they've been shooting for. And it makes them God as well. Now, in 1927, there was the movie Metropolis, which deals with this theme. And Fritz Lang, who made the movie, he got chased out by the Nazis eventually. But originally, they tried to recruit him. But this movie was made in 1927 with $5 million. And something heavy duty was behind the development of this movie. And it is so advanced on this level, as things German very often are. But in one of the scenes, they take one of the worker characters, the scientist, and teleports her consciousness into this cyborg. So this concept now that we're talking about, this is 1927. Yes, we've had things like Frankenstein, which is also a deep mystery school impact on the culture. But this, I think, is important and something that's very revealing for us now. And it gives us that hint that there are people back there who already know what's in the pipeline and what's coming up. All right. So with that in mind, I'm going to mention, actually, I'm going to show you a couple more of these automatons, and then I'm going to get into somebody who was very plugged into it. I'm going to show his artwork here around this. But first, okay, so Frank Baum, we know he did The Wizard of Oz. He was a theosophist. He was there in Coronado, and he was working with heavy-duty mystery themes. Here he is working with a story before The Wizard of Oz, and it's called Ozma of Oz, and it's part of the Oz series. And it is, it's actually called TikTok, the whole thing. But The Clockwork Man and the Children's Story, Ozma of Oz by L. Frank Baum. TikTok had to be wound up with a key, and one spring was wound for movement, and one spring was wound for thinking. Here we go. We're talking really early on, sort of World War I period. And we have the outlay of the automatons coming into the culture. We're starting to understand what it is. Early versions of automatons set up. They couldn't do all the things that, you know, robots can do now, but it was there. It was being placed before the culture. In Wired magazine, they did an article on this. Bots of Yore, Centuries of Tinkering with Uncanny Automatons. Martin Scorsese's 3D epic Hugo. This is from 2011. Wired gets inspired to take a look back at some of the first automatons in action. That is very interesting to me. Again, they were playing with this, and that early automaton that he's playing with there. This is what we're getting into now. You mentioned Sophia, the robot, and I think it's Asimo, is that it? Yeah. And Asimo is one of the most advanced, and, you know, he walks around, he's supposed to be a helper and all the rest of it, but the place where they're getting very advanced is with these soldier robots. And one of the things that the San Diego Police Department just asked for is the ability to place guns on their robots. And it's like a pilot program. This is something, it's interesting to me that it's coming out of California because, you know, it's going to be harder and harder, in my opinion, for them to keep regular people, you know, enforcing those ridiculous laws that they are laying out there. But I think we're looking at something here. This is the actual definition in Casey's time of what automaton meant. An apparatus that automatically performs certain actions by responding to preset controls or coded instructions. Electronic machine equipped and designed automatically in response to instructions previously fed into it. A person or animal acting in a mechanical way. So we have to then revisit the Casey readings with this in mind, because originally they were like, you know, I think the first people who were investigating the Casey work were thinking, this is where all the centaurs and all this kind of stuff comes from. However, as we look at it, we can see very clearly, you know, we're looking at something bigger still, because the Casey, again, there's no time with the Casey thing. He's going back 10,000 years into Atlantis. He's going into our future. And so this is the nature of what he's looking at. One of the people who shows up in this kind of period in the 1940s and 50s is an artist named Boris Artzybasheff. And Boris is fascinating, and his artwork is kind of steampunk, you know, if you know the look. But it also carries with it this understanding of transhumanism arriving, its implications, and all the rest of it. What I found interesting when I went into his background, there's a few things that tipped me off to him. One is the admiration that Minsky had for him. And two, he was he was somebody who that around these Atlantis people who they had called upon to do illustrations and things, and I'm going to get into that. Renowned for his ability to turn machines into living beings and living beings into who knows what in his artwork, he was an advisor in psychological warfare operations during World War II for the U.S. I found that fascinating. He was born in Ukraine. And he had a fascinating book called When Machines Come to Life. Let's take a quick look at some of the artwork he was bringing through. This one, when I looked at it, I'll tell you what it made me think of, oddly enough. I thought of Crowley, and I'll show you why.
What time period was that produced in?
This picture actually comes from 1949.
Wow.
And look at that. It is quite remarkable.
You know, the face reminds me of E.T.
Oh, it really does.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent point. I'll put that up one more time. These, you know, the artwork and illustrations that he's doing are advanced in conveying that message, again, going past just explaining it and going directly to the subconscious to reveal what's happening. The pose, though, and the pyramid on the forehead, take note of that, because this is sort of the inverse of that we get with Crowley and his pose. But again, it's that pyramid on the head. Isn't that fascinating?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
What was the name of the artist again?
Oh, you're going to get me on that one. He has quite an elaborate name. It's Boris Artzybasheff. And we'll go further into him so we'll get a better idea of his background, etc. But the spelling on it, Artzybasheff. And he died in 1965. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be very interesting the way we tie this in together. Okay, how are we doing on time? All right, I have to hustle here. Here's what we'll do. This, I think, is a very telling image that he did. So we have a skeleton back there, and we have the insertion of this kind of bony hand of something into the brain. Take a look at that.
Wow. I hate to say what that reminds me of.
Tell me.
Something that's coming up under microscopes.
Ah, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting indeed. Well, given the level of this guy's access, I wouldn't be surprised at all. And let's see, I have one more of his to show in here. This, which is, you know, almost comical when you look at it. And yet it is someone who's very plugged in on what's coming in. That image from 1952, again, very strong overtures here. Now, one of the things about Boris is that he is going to be specially requested by someone. In other words, someone's going to say, I'm going to appear on this Time magazine cover, and I really want this guy to do the image. Well, let's take a look at who requested him and how does this all come together. This is a particularly strange and interesting piece. Before I get to that, actually, I wanted to show a couple of quick images. This is that figure, Iltar, in Casey's mythology. Iltar escapes the destruction of Atlantis. And yeah, we have the fishes and people in the water looking for him. Iltar makes it to Yucatan and redevelops an Atlantis-style culture there, including depositing the Hall of Records, interestingly enough. And then later, I found this picture. Actually, it was Greg Little's, one of those ARE guys. Later, this group that's in the Yucatan will go to Ohio and then to Illinois. And one of the mound sites, the reconstruction of the Kincaid mounds here, I thought that image was quite interesting and compelling, giving us that hint. Now, I've said before, there's a weird crisscross between the transhumanist champions like Minsky, you know, the father of AI and this whole thing, directly out of MIT, and the whole Finding Atlantis group, good and bad. Say the good part, the Colonel Sanders' daughter piece, the evil side, the Maxwell and Epstein piece, looking for the same thing, probably there in the hot zone, but for very different purposes. So you're looking at two cults there, looking for the same thing. In 1975, in fact, there was a radio show that featured Carl Sagan, Jacques Cousteau, and our friend Marvin Minsky. Cousteau and Minsky, again, where do they feature next? Where can I find them again in history? I find them in that strange Virginia Giuffre deposition against Prince Andrew, where she says they wanted me to target this guy Minsky, but they also wanted to target somebody else, Alexandra Cousteau, who's the granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau, who did an 8-year-long study and series on finding Atlantis. So these things start to add up and piece together. We start to understand the nature of what this other thing is, and it's operating there in the hot zone. We've done the episodes, and there's a whole series of playlists right here on this channel that'll show you all the hot zone episodes that we've done over the past 4 years. Those hot zone episodes bring in Ernest Hemingway, they bring in JFK, and they bring in Edgar Cayce and the fact that the Cayce and the Hemingways were close. And they explain a lot about the Hemingways in relation to Atlantis. Without even getting into that part tonight, we're going to find, just dealing there in the hot zone with some of these scientific pieces, how all this starts to click together. And I think we're seeing some of those parts now. Everyone, you're watching Dark Journalist X Series 136. Deep tonight on the transhumanist aspect, the automatons, and Atlantis. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. I'm hustling through the rest of this to get it done. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, especially if you're new here, to sign up for our newsletter. And that's a newsletter that comes out once a week. It just lets you, it's a free newsletter, and it lets you know what shows are coming up and the important things that we have coming up for you here on the show. You can go ahead and subscribe when you get to the show, when you get to the site as well, to support the activities that we're doing here. And we will, in that newsletter, you will find sort of up to date what's happening, because things change quickly, or we might do special reports, all the rest of it. You can't always rely on YouTube to give you that information. I'm sorry to say.
Definitely not.
And I think a lot of our social media has been suppressed, it's for a long time. So I kind of don't really, I just keep working through it and forget about their algorithms for things. But I can tell you that the newsletter works best. So, and that's, again, that's free for you, or you can sign up for a membership as well. That's all at darkjournalist.com. Okay. Before we go any further, Miss Olivia.
Unclarabi wants to know, when the Atlanteans invaded Egypt, the Egyptians recorded them in history as the, quote, sea people.
Yeah. There's some questions about that. Because the Phoenicians were also around in other periods, much later. So the echo of the Atlantis culture coming in seems to be in the pyramid building style. This is what gives us the echo of the culture. That's the founding culture. What we get later is an interesting height of dynastic Egypt, and it's an echo of what was happening at a much earlier period of time. I think there are periods in Egyptian history, like the Akhenaten period, which expose that there was something much deeper going on, as the priesthoods had to oust Akhenaten because the same type of Belial Emilius thing was taking place there. So it is quite fascinating. The most interesting thing for me about ancient Egypt is that the emphasis around the afterlife and the mummification techniques that they had were so superior that when you look at those mummies now, you almost think, with a little luck, they could be resuscitated. But when medical officials were looking at what they were doing, you know, and how they would remove things like they would remove the brain through the nose. How advanced do you have to be in those ancient times to do those things properly and preserve the organs? So when you send the pharaoh on his journey, the idea of actually him resuscitating is possible. You know, we have an unusual mystery there about the technologies that they used to achieve these things. We still don't understand how they built the pyramids, and the explanations are so dumb. If you've ever seen those programs that are the traditional story about how these things are done, it doesn't make any sense, and the time periods don't make any sense. So we need new answers for these things, and then you get sites like Göbekli Tepe that give us a much older reference, and once you open that up, you're right there then in Casey's time period about the end of Atlantis, 10,500 BC. Okay. Now you have a major megalithic structure that 20 years ago they didn't really acknowledge. So now that we have that on the record, we can get past this academic block, because when you get into those levels of academia, forget it. You know, you can imagine that they get so established and they get so powerful in their dating system that that's where their whole identity comes from. And so that anything that comes in from the outside, they can just say, oh, you know, you don't know, or, you know, I remember distinctly around the weathering of the Sphinx. This is really the straw that broke the camel's back. You know, Casey had said, well, the Sphinx was there, the Great Pyramid, 10,500 BC. And everyone said, well, we have material here from 2,500 BC. How do you account for the 8,000 years in between? And so we had a geologist go in, and he said, oh, the Sphinx was weathered by rains. And so they didn't have rain unless you go back in Egypt, unless you go back to that 10,000 BC period. So that should have settled the question, but it didn't, because the archaeological forces and the forces in society who don't want that story out, they don't want to rewrite history, and they don't want to give us that credit. And they also don't want to refer back to Atlantis. So, you know, you've got all kinds of things and forces in there. What you have to do, in my opinion, is you have to take the strongest case, and you make the strongest case based on the mystery school records and the actual records on the ground, and you combine those two and you get a real version of history. The rest of this stuff, you know, that everybody basically, like, you know, cavemen and then some turned into the pyramids. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. If anything, some of the most interesting researchers have noted something, which is that the quality of work as you go through ancient Egypt goes down. It doesn't go up. So they're coming out of a great Renaissance and going down through the thousands of years. It's not going up and saying, oh, they're getting better and better and better, and like, hey, you know, they'll make greater pyramids. No. If the Great Pyramids were made in 10,500 BC, then everything else in Egypt was actually a degradation from that height. This is an interesting way for us to look at that culture. But here's another thing. If we were so advanced there in the Atlantean period, and, you know, we had things like flight, we had space programs, we had scientific knowledge on this level, and, you know, all the things that are discussed in the Casey readings, then what happened to it? And the only thing that we can say is the destruction that was wrought by the misuse of those technologies created such an apotheum that it's almost like a trauma. You know, when Graham Hancock says it's a species, we're a species with amnesia, that's what he's getting at, which is there's such a trauma there that there's a cutoff point, and we restart, and you go to the same way that you would if there was a nuclear exchange now. This whole thing would be wiped out, and you'd start from very, very primitive origins right up the chain all over again. And they'd maybe be an echo of a story back there about a culture that got up to a certain point and just, you know, blew each other up. So we're walking through those doors again. And so it's hopefully with this kind of awareness, remembering, you know, bringing back the unconscious race memory of the whole thing, that we go into a totally different stage with it. Okay, I'm going to jump here to more of the images I was just showing. What do you got?
Ogum5 says, how might Daniel contextualize the Sumerians and the Anunnaki, who seem to echo Atlantean narratives?
Oh, there's no question about that. I think there were simultaneous things happening in different cultures, for sure. I think there's an echo in the Sumerian work, in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Those Noah stories, everybody took part in the flood. And the flood in the CAYCE work is the second destruction of Atlantis. It's not the final one, interestingly enough. So you've got various legends of floods because you had periods of different floods. But by 10,500 BC, everything had switched and things were in a new position. So there's an archaeoastronomy piece, I think, that we can look at with this. And this is where I think people like Robert Bravall and stuff have gone, that, the pyramids face out looking at these stars in 10,500 BC. The Sphinx looks out at Leo. And if you move it to 2,500 BC, the Sphinx looks out at Taurus. And it's like, oh, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would they make a line to look out at a bull? So these things start to open up. And I think that there's enough research on the ground for us to change that version of history. Absolutely. But that's part of the revolution in consciousness around these things that includes the understanding around the UFO file and the mystery school legacy. So the way that this is rediscovered by humanity, I think, is important. The co-opting thing and the sugarcoating and the fuzzy version that they're trying to give it through intelligence agencies, media sources, marketing companies, really the culture needs the wake-up call on the other side, and that's what I think is so important and so exciting about the work that's taking place here. Okay, I'll give you a little more on our friend Boris, okay? Now here, he does a whole series where he goes through the hot zone and he gives us, for example, Bermuda. This one is interesting. And now, as I mentioned, there's a very interesting shipping magnate, powerful character in history, who requests his artistic services for when he's going to be on the cover of Time. And I want to get into him a little bit. That is a shot there, so we know where we are of the hot zone. And let's keep this in mind as we go. You've got Bimini there, the western tip of Cuba, there where Polina Zalitsky found her Cuban city. And over here is the Yucatan Peninsula, where CAYCE said the fleeing Atlanteans went. This is the area, as I've said, that when there are people who are working for the government or working mapping the ocean floor, working for oil companies, things of that nature, that they have to sign different documents that say if they see structures of an ancient type, that they can't report them. They have to report them to their superiors, and they're not allowed to support them outside of that. That area is called, in those circles, various names, but the hot zone is the one that really sticks. And there's a reason why they call it the hot zone. I think it literally is that the information is too hot to handle. That's the way that I interpret it. But in any case, if you're not familiar with it, there it is. And that, of course, is the shot of the lost city of Cuba that Zelinsky found, where it was. And there we have those pyramids. I have a bigger shot of that. And we've done episodes on Zelinsky. And, Zelinsky is very interesting. And her work was fascinating. And I think she made a big breakthrough. And I think she was ultimately used by Cuba. And she was kind of blackballed by the archaeological community for her incredible finds. I've had some communication with her, and I've tried to basically encourage her to come forward more on these things. And I think, she probably, it was such a hassle when she did it that I think she's in a place where she really is not wanting to re-engage, all of that, but hopefully she will come back to us. Okay. Let's look at something here. It is called the Atlantis yacht. Huh. And this was the biggest yacht, and it was the biggest of the best for a long time. The person who made it, he made 3 of them ultimately. And for me, this guy is definitely a powerful individual. And he was one of the shipping magnates. I've got his, I'm actually going to read his bio here. But he was basically in competition with Onassis, and him playing, this role in the whole Kennedy drama and the Jackie O piece with all that. It's quite remarkable. Now, before I get into Stavros and this whole piece, actually, I want to do a little quick catch-up thing on Casey here. There was a letter that came in. Let's see. So basically, yeah, that's also maybe something worth looking at, which is Casey in relation to the Sphinx, where he said, this is where the Hall of Records is. And one of the things I think that's important to keep in mind is that a number of traditional archaeologists were funded and helped along by Casey in relation to finds in Egypt, and have not given him the true credit, and have basically said, oh yeah, Casey and all that weird stuff. In the meantime, they took all the grants and everything else from the ARE. And, the ARE has tried to promote this Atlantis knowledge, and they have unfortunately worked with very crooked people like Zahi Hawass and others who, if anything, just want to make sure that that story goes nowhere. Couple of quick things. This is an image from a NASA scientist trying to work out what Casey was talking about when getting to this whole thing about the Atlanteans and the Two Eyes Stone. He figured from the readings, from his own scientific knowledge, this is how it would look. And it's a 6-sided figure, and it takes on a kind of bluish color. And he went through and designed models for it and figured, actually, after a certain period of time, you know what, this thing makes a lot of sense. Now, I wonder what they did with that research. He was a retired NASA scientist, and his work is very, very interesting. I'm actually going to read a quote from him in a little bit. All right. Let's put a couple of things together and then go to the yachtsman. All right. This is a letter to Hugh Lynn Casey, and it comes in 1969. It is from the son of Margaret Sanders, who is the daughter of Colonel Sanders, Trig Adams, who I've mentioned on this program. And we had a really good thing going with Trig. He was talking about coming on the program, and both he and members of the family, the Sanders family, who were giving me information relating to the Hot Zone and all the rest, completely went off the radar, and they completely stopped saying anything about it. And I have not been able to really re-engage them. At a certain point, they were, all up and hunky-dory for everything, and were very helpful, and I appreciate that. And I realize it's not an easy thing to get into your own family history about it. However, it's a little strange, I have to say, just to go on the record here, that after the talk that I had with the Sanders family, and with Trig Adams in particular, who's, a very respected pilot and has a lot to tell, especially in relation to the Bimini Wall and all the rest, for that just to go, So Trig, if you're out there, I'm still up for you coming on the program anytime, but I haven't heard anything from any of you guys in a while. Okay. Dear Hugh Lynn, this is Trig Adams' letter to Hugh Lynn. It has come to my attention that Colonel Rockwell, head of North American Rockwell Corporation, is a member of the ARE. the company has recently been acquiring large areas of Bimini and the islands south for development, much like those suggested in the readings. I'm led to believe that the readings provided the impetus for this action, although I doubt at the corporate level this would ever be widely known, if at all. I was hoping that you might be able to give us any information if this is not supposed to be a secret and you know of any. Also, it would be possible to arrange an introduction through you. It sure would be helpful. And he goes on from there. This is pretty interesting. Rockwell International defense contractor buys up a large portion of Bimini and Cat Cay, which is an island right beside it. And now, right now, there's a $250 million housing development there. And it's like the elite of the elite are living on that strip. And I can only wonder if it isn't a front row seat to the Poseidon Temple rising, as Casey had predicted. And here we have early on this head of the Rockwell International Defense Contracting Company, who also was involved with NASA. He's a member of the ARE. He is very plugged into the whole Atlantis piece. I'm going to get into a scientist on the Nazi side who was also very aware of the CAYCE piece. A couple of things just to plug in. Well, actually, I'll say that. A tiny island in the western Bahamas, Cat Cay was for about 30 years until 1964 an exclusive and expensive playground for American millionaires and their friends. Last May, Willard Rockwell Jr., board chairman, North American Rockwell, and a group of fellow investors purchased Cat Cay, and since that time have restored and improved much of the original club's facilities. The new concrete docks in the harbor, when all are completed, will be able to berth nearly 100 good-sized boats, new waters, and power lines. Cat Cay is a marvelous place for anglers, and they go on and on and on. So it turns out that our friend there, Willard Rockwell Jr., the chairman of North American Rockwell, bought up Cat Cay. So there they have this incredible spot right in the crucial area of the hot zone where Casey was discussing it. And as major defense contractors, they ruled the roost in that area from the 60s through the 90s. Something else to keep in mind in relation to this is that Casey, when discussing the Sons of Belial, talked about the echoes left over from, in the different cultures, Mayan, Aztec, and the rest of it. And so, this is what we're talking about when you're thinking about Epstein and Maxwell and the Belial cult and the thing that they want to plug back into in order to, kind of achieve this level, a black magic level on an esoteric level, but also to reconnect with that original Atlantis culture. These Belial priests coming from a totally different end of the spectrum. And, just like we get the incredible lift from looking at images of grandeur of these, the Great White Brotherhood and others, just take a look at some of these images. I mean, these are some dark characters, and this is what they were up against in that period. And no wonder they were looking for Rata to come in and save them. And this one, considering the mixtures, and then someone had mentioned Sumerian culture. There we have the winged sphinx, which you see that quite a bit. Of course, Ahriman himself shows up as what? He's a chimerical figure, in fact. And he, is operating with the whole snake lion piece. All right. Something interesting to note in relation to the hot zone, because the UFO file is involved here after all, is that our friend Thomas Townsend Brown is down there and spending all this time on the western tip of Cuba, presumably before the Cuban Revolution. And he is working on so many deep projects, but they relate to things like the Philadelphia experiment, time travel, and he also is working on anti-gravity and, just a phenomenal amount of deep projects. And he's, through my conversations with his daughter, I came to learn that he really was somebody who was on the X-share side. This is somebody who wanted to share the technology with the culture to bring it forward. And unfortunately, the X-Protect side hemmed him in often. One of the interesting things that came up in my conversation with John Warner about his dad, who was Secretary of the Navy, taking the family down to Eleuthera, is that that is the same island that Thomas Townsend Brown, when he was getting too much heat from the brass and from the deep state, wanting him to work on black projects, he would take his family down with security guards to Eleuthera Island. Something, again, there in the hot zone. One of the things that came up was that our friend Thomas Townsend Brown was working with a scientist and who was a self-made millionaire. And he was looking for Thomas Townsend Brown to develop this anti-gravitics. Now, the other person who was working with this scientist was someone we know in the UFO field named George Adamski. And Adamski is there, and he's working with this story about being visited by Orthon. But weird things do happen with Adamski. And so I don't dismiss him as somebody who, you know, was just working on a lark. The military accepts him on such a deep level, and he was given a military burial also, which is interesting. He was deep, deep into theosophy, and he was somebody who produced early on all kinds of footage of UFOs. So he's very advanced. He's one of the first. Now, something interesting happens when you go into the research around this scientist, Thomas Townsend Brown, and our friend Adamski, which is there's a picture inside the lab of the scientist that Brown is working with. And it shows the Adamski scout ship model in an oil test chamber. So this is the UFO, you know, that shows up in so many of the images. This is a scale model of it, and it's sitting in oil. So either they're working with a scale model, or they developed this thing, and that's what they got to fly, and that's where it comes from. Now, I've talked a lot about the UFO threat aspect and how they want to build a false UFO threat about how aliens would come down here and we need the Central Intelligence Agency to defend us. And, you know, they get to invoke emergency powers and take over with the continuity of government style program. What's interesting is there's probably also a separate op, which is totally different, and motivated by a totally different, again, we have that X-Protect and X-Share thing. That other op could be to create a peaceful alien op, to have these aliens come down and say, make peace. And so that's the thesis in a book by that scientist that I was talking about, who was a pilot, and his name was Agnew Bonson Jr. That's a shot of him there. And I've showed this book a couple of times. It's been a while because it was related. And, you know, people say that, you know, you can't work with psychic activity when you're doing solid research. Well, in some work with G.G. Young, it came up that there was a character in a book that kept coming up in this psychic work. And when I tracked it down, the character was in this book. So that's directly from G.G. psychic activity directly into my line of research. So let me tell you, if you don't have the psychic aspect working for you, then you're actually missing a whole piece of it. And I say that in relation to deep state work too. If you're not considering the mystery school, the esoteric side, then your whole lens is different. You're missing quite a bit. In The Stars Are Too High, just listen to the setup for the premise here. That's the name of the book, The Stars Are Too High. By the way, shortly after he put this out, he went down in a plane crash. The appearance of a strange spaceship brings astounding results in the Pentagon and Kremlin and this prophetic novel of the near future. And what happens basically is a group that has the ability to is of very advanced scientists to create something that would be totally different from any other technology that's available on Earth. They develop this, and then they pretend to be aliens in order to have peace break out. we have to kind of keep that in mind when we think about the Thomas Townsend Browns, Adamski, and some of these other figures that were around in that period. Brown, of course, a very distinguished scientist. And Adamski, a lot of people just think, oh, this was somebody who was, one of those contactee space brother people. I think that, there was some showboating involved, as there were with a lot of these figures. However, it appears that there was a depth level to Adamski's work, and the crisscross with T.T. Brown and Adamski, and then the model of this ship sitting in a vat of oil in this laboratory that looks exactly like the Adamski ship, leads us to an interesting place. One of the things that T.T. Brown's daughter told me is that he, when they were in Virginia, their farm, that there was a visitation, that those craft came down, the Adamski style craft came down, and that this is when she's very young, and she sees her father go out to meet them, talk with them, and that they give him a device, which is basically like an iPad. And he keeps this device throughout his whole time while he's working, but he keeps it separate from the military, and nobody knows anything about it. And at the end of his life, what happens is he's on his deathbed, and she's there with him. And he says, you see those men out there, they're after the device that they gave me. And she says, who are they? What do you want to do? And he says, don't deal with them. And then he is looking at the people there, and he's saying, all they want to do, and all they've been trying to do every time they come up here, is pressure me to give them the device. So somehow they had learned that he had this thing. Who gave it to him? Who were the group that landed in the back of his farm and gave him this unusual device? I have no idea. And yet there's something so strange about that story that I think we have to keep it in mind. And of course, all the people who were involved, who had come to visit him at the hospital and pressure him at the last moment, were CIA people. And I'll tell you, I see them involved in the same UFO threat activity now. So when I take her experience at his deathbed and I extrapolate it out to what we're going through, it's kind of like they're still after, controlling this narrative, etc. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight here in X Series 136. This is the Hot Zone UFO File, and we've looked closely at Amelius, the Automatons, Atlantis, or all A's tonight. AUTEC. Let's take a spin through. Let's see how much time we have here. Well, I will go to your questions. Let's say we'll go to questions in 5 minutes. How does that grab you? All right. How's it going out there?
Great.
Okay, fantastic. Let's do this. Let's look at, and I might dedicate some more time to him solo. Let's look at our friend here, Otto Muck. Otto Muck was a Nazi scientist, and he was somebody who we got through the paperclip program, and he was a big wheel in Peenemünde. Now, that's a shot of him there. One of the things that he's known for is this incredible book about Atlantis that he put out. And what's interesting is it came out in German, and it didn't come out here until 1978. He was dead by then. What's interesting is he wrote the book in 1954, and he died shortly afterwards. So there's a lot of mystery about him. And then later they found 200 pages of notes that they strung together and again translated into English. Let's get just a quick background on him here. Otto Heinrich Muck, a Viennese, flew for the Germans in World War I in 1921. He graduated with a degree in engineering from the Munich College of Advanced Technology and continued his studies in physics, geophysics, and early history, the ideal combination for an eventual study of Atlantis. In World War II, he invented the snorkel for U-boats and was a key member of the research team at Peenemünde for developing the V-2 rocket. Two of the most effective instruments in the Nazi arsenal. After the war, he worked for the Greek ship owner Stavros Niarchos, developing methane tankers. The Secret of Atlantis was published in English in 1978. Okay, let's have a little bit of fun with this. Stavros Niarchos was the shipping magnate I referred to earlier, and he was the competitor to our friend Onassis. These guys supposedly became the most important, richest men in the world because their tanker business took off when they could, carry the oil tankers on their shipping lines. But in fact, if you go just a little bit deeper, they're both heavily involved in drug running. They're both heavily involved in different types of trafficking. And that was the rumor with Onassis for a long, long time. Now, what we need to do is put ourselves in the heads of these guys a little bit differently. Everyone wants to see them through like mafia or the prism of the deep state and all these. That's all true. But I only want us to look at them through their interest in the Hot Zone in Atlantis, just for the purposes of this, because they come to life a lot more, and some of their activities look a lot more natural when we do that. Okay, Otto Muck wrote a wonderful book about Atlantis in 1976. Of course, Charles Berlitz was the most famous at the time, but Otto Muck approached the subject in a more scientific way. Okay, he basically was saying that Atlantis was destroyed 12,000 years ago by a comet. Otto Muck and many other writers have given strong evidence that Atlantis really existed. Okay. Plato told us that Atlantis sank 9,000 years before Solon. So even his date, 9500 BC, coincides closely with Casey's 10,500 BC. And this guy was talking 12,000 years. He's 10,000 BC. So they're all in that same ballpark. Otto Muck believed that the Atlantis disaster was the same as the Bible flood. However, he believed that the disaster was caused by a massive asteroid that fell near Bimini Island in the West Indies. He calculated that the asteroid brought 30-meter rainfall to the Earth. The rainfall was not enough to cause the Bible's flood, and that's only why Otto Muck has developed a strange theory. Even if we've seen Noah's Ark in Ararat, Otto Muck tells us that the real place for the Ark was not Ararat, but another mountain called Cudi. The Cudi, C-U-D-I, was much lower than Ararat. It is hardly possible. Now, and they go on, but it's interesting because Ararat is also the name of the early king in the CAYCE period. So this name also coincides with Moses, for example. And Moses goes up to Mount Ararat. So, but I think what's important about Muck's investigation of Atlantis, one, being a Nazi scientist and exploring the V-2 rocket, he is operating at a very advanced level scientifically. I think it's strange that he dies in an industrial accident so quickly after he puts the book out. But the other thing that's interesting to me is that he puts forward this thought that the comet hits directly near Bimini Island. Now, Bimini was basically the stronghold of the Poseidons. It was the last kind of Amelius stronghold. And so many of the other islands had gone down in Atlantis, but this area was still there. So the area that was, between right there in the hot zone that we're talking about, between the tip of Florida, the western tip of Cuba, and the Yucatan Peninsula, that whole area now he's bringing in and he's saying this is where the comet hit. There was a landmass there. Interestingly enough, Paulina Zalitsky, in her research, when she found the Cuban city underwater, she said there was a mountain range that went directly between Cuba and Yucatan. That would explain a lot about that area. And it would also explain how fundamentally what we understand as Atlantis went down in 10,500 BC. But there are stories after that, Celtic legends about these glass temples down in the area of Bimini. But they seem to be talking about a much bigger landmass. It apparently survived longer, that area. And that it's interesting to me that he's saying, well, a comet came in and took it out, because we could have had the actual destruction of Atlantis and things, they were getting back to normal, and there was one final destruction. Interestingly enough, in the CAYCE writings, he talks about Iltar going to Yucatan and creating another version of Atlantis, but then that version of Atlantis experiences all kinds of earthquakes and problems, so that he has to take his group into Ohio. So, we're looking at kind of disaster. It's a disaster era. It's not just, there's one big disaster and then they get back to normal. It's an ongoing process for a while. And that, I think, is absolutely fascinating. But he mentioned our friend there with the Atlantis yacht. That's who Otto Muck was working for, Lavros, who was the competitor of Onassis. So suddenly we find ourselves in the middle of Muck, who is famous for writing his Atlantis book that was really advanced, but he got bumped off shortly after. And he's working for Lavros, who names his yachts Atlantis and is just, as powerful a figure as Onassis, if not bigger. So when we look at the combinations of who these people are, I have a section here on Lavros, but I'm going to go, Miss Olivia, to your questions, because this gets us into Onassis and Jackie O, and I'm going to loop it in, but I think we better start with questions now. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I've got questions all over the place. So I'm just going to start since
right.
You were talking about Onassis. Tina Boric earlier was asking, didn't Bobby Kennedy ask LBJ directly why he killed his brother?
He did. That's caught in a photograph of Robert Kennedy punching a pillar outside of the White House, and LBJ making this face. And they were in a terrible fight. And the photographer was like, I can't believe this. I have to take a shot of this. And in the middle of it, RFK said to LBJ, why did you have my brother killed? And that's the face. You could see the face of the picture. If I had the picture, that'd be great timing. But yes, that did happen. And later, there's all kinds of moves. There's blackmail moves between RFK, LBJ, and Nixon relating to JFK's assassination. And the entire relationship between LBJ and Nixon can be defined by the fact of LBJ saying, I know that you prevented peace talks with Vietnam until you got in, and I have it recorded, and you're going to do what I say now that I'm leaving the presidency and you're taking over. And Nixon saying, I know that you had a role in Kennedy's assassination with the CIA, and if you try to blackmail me with that, you're going to be in deep trouble. That game goes on so hardcore that there was an X letter that is at the LBJ Museum and the LBJ Library, and it's still there. It's supposed to be opened in 2023. Somebody got antsy and opened it in 1995 after Nixon died, and 2 of the pages they looked at eventually got classified. And then they said, oh, you know what? We'll wrap up. We'll put the letter back, actually, letter X, and we'll open it appropriately in 2023. And then they put in a little clause, but if the director of the library feels that it would upset national security, then we won't do it. So there's an X letter using that X steganography move that LBJ said this should be opened in 50 years, right before his death in 1973. So there it is, 2023. He wanted whatever it is about Nixon on the record. Now, when you look at the kind of thing, I wanted to call that, I call them stealth archives, but they're also sort of like, they're declarations of disclosure that are waiting in the wings. And we have presidents all the way back who worked on the UFO issue. And so when it comes out, whether it was inevitable because, too much of a public had seen it, or because they defined some way to tell the public about this, then all those presidents wanted to be on the record in relation to it. If you go through Reagan's period, if you go through Carter and all the rest, you're going to see that presidential piece. But the X letter is still there at the LBJ library, and I'm sure the right people have looked at it, but we haven't been able to look at it, just like with the JFK records. Just like with these different studies the Rockefellers did in 1956 about UFOs. We can't get our hands on. We know that they're there, and it's a free society, so we get to know that there are JFK assassination records that the CIA is holding. We get to know there's an LBJ letter, X letter, that the library is holding about Nixon, but we don't get to see them. So this is the nature of the stealth archives. It's a weird, anti-transparency transparency, right? In other words, yes, we'll tell you it's there, but you can't see it. So stealth archives becomes a foundation of the kind of journalism, the dark journalism that we do on this show. It comes up a lot. Yes.
Karen Carpenter, why did Jackie Kennedy marry Onassis?
Well, it's supposedly for protection because, she marries him right after RFK is assassinated. It's just a few months later. And, her own husband, who was the president, was killed. And she fears that her children are going to suffer the same fate after going to RFK's funeral. So supposedly this sped up the process, but she had met Onassis even before JFK was assassinated. They didn't have any kind of romantic relationship, but he had tried to get in close with the Kennedys. And it's interesting because Kennedy regarded him very, very, with a keen eye, and was not somebody that he wanted him in his inner circle. However, there's a lot of rumors that he worked closely with Kennedy's dad in the early days shipping stuff. And so, there's a leftover there, and a lot of competition takes place between Kennedy and Onassis. And I really, my feeling is that Onassis knows a great deal about how that works. And there were documents that would come out in the 1970s that related to Howard Hughes and the Gemstone file. And those documents would lay so much of everything on Onassis' doorstep. There's a lot of weird things about Onassis himself, though, including the fact that his son is killed in a plane crash. And, eventually, of course, he divorces Jackie and he dies, So there's a lot there which suggests to me that his value to whoever he was serving became very limited after a while. Very interesting.
They want to know what the book is under the camera. Peter Dale Scott, right?
It's American Deep State by Peter Dale Scott. Yeah. And that's the camera I'm shooting my documentary with as well. So it's a good 1-2 per. Yes.
Okay, we're going to stick with politics just for a minute, even though it's off topic a little bit, because I know you would like this this question. Jay Vandervest. Nixon had a Quaker upbringing. I went to his library, walked through his house. What happened? What's the deal with Nixon, and why? With a Quaker upbringing, you would think he would be a lighter soul, a holier being.
Well, I think Nixon understood the system. See, Nixon came from kind of a nothing background. He was raised on a poor farm. And 2 of his brothers died of consumption, So, he had it really hard. And I think what he learned with his smarts is that he could outsmart the world. And very early on, a group discovers him, a group of businessmen discover Nixon and run him for office. So he's one of these cases. Nixon, I think, is very tricky. He's simultaneously moving the culture forward. And he's also somebody who engaged for the deep state with the heavy Vietnam militarization. Although he created at the end of that a peace plan, and he inherited Vietnam, so the whole thing can't be laid on him. But he comes up as a very interesting figure in all of it. He was also Ike's VP for 8 years, and was also in charge of CIA Blue Book. So this is somebody who knew a great deal about the UFO file. He's an incredible opportunist, but an incredibly capable person. And in terms of being a Republican, by today's standards, he's almost liberal, because he creates the EPA, wage and price controls, all these types of things that are hallmarks of legitimate liberal philosophy. What's unfortunate is that the liberals have gone so far away from anything like that traditional liberals are, called Nazis or whatever now by this thing that is trying to, it's interesting because it's basically the neocons took over the Democratic Party and they didn't realize it. They just they knew how to excite them for different things and say, hey, war is good, and they bought into the propaganda of it. Liberals used to hate war. This used to be the thing. They used to protest war and all the rest of it. Now they love it. Now they're like, let's get those Russians, and you never hear anyone talk about a peace process, Republican or Democrat. Like, where's all that? Maybe libertarians talk about it. So we're in a real problem. But traditionally, I think the traditional liberals, it's odd because they used to portray Nixon as like a right winger and all the rest. But if you look at his history, it doesn't quite add up. In terms of the Quaker thing, on his way out, when he was facing resignation and all that, he quotes from the Quaker, the peace at the center and all that. So yeah, it's still in there. I mean, he certainly got corrupted along the way. However, he became enough of an independent player that when he wanted to move for UFO disclosure and different things, he had to be ousted. And the deep state removed him after using him. And it's interesting because that's what you find out when you study the deep state is they use these people for a period of time that they're useful. Look at LBJ. They squeezed him out. And he couldn't even run for re-election. He was so unpopular. Those were the spoils for participating in the charade of, pretending that he was taking over and he was shocked that JFK had been assassinated. He was certainly aware of Kennedy's impending assassination, and it was his only ticket out because when, at that time, when they took that turn onto Elm Street, LBJ was headed to prison. And there was a Senate committee looking into his people who had already gone to prison, Billy Celestes, Bobby Brown, so I mean, that's where he was headed. And RFK, had assisted this process of ousting him from the ticket. That's where they were headed. The day before Kennedy is assassinated, Nixon, who's in Dallas, gives an interview at a press conference and says, there's no way LBJ will be on that ticket in 64. He knew. So everyone knew LBJ was on his way out. And so LBJ basically plugs into this thing because it's his only means of survival. And so they probably say to him, this is what's going to go on and you'll be the new top dog. Other schools of thought and other people I've talked to give LBJ a bigger lead role in the assassination. He's certainly involved, but I think the lead role is with the Central Intelligence Agency using and corrupting different elements. Yes.
I just wanted to add that Oliver Stone's Nixon is actually a great movie.
Oh yeah.
And
very true to life.
And I've heard it said that Nixon was on the spectrum and probably had Asperger's. And that for me, we've had this discussion. And that movie, although it doesn't say that explicitly, it sort of alludes to that. He seemed to be fascinated with how to be popular, just being an outsider, being obsessed with the idea of power and also the power of being liked, of being loved, of being looked up to, and that someone on the spectrum might have a difficult time trying to understand the American populace and how to appeal to them, because of course he was very naturally unappealing, and that he was captivated by this idea, and he would have been much more comfortable being an academic, a professor. Right?
Oh, that's what Kissinger said about him. There's so many things, I think, with Nixon that, you know, one of his quotes is that I played by the rules, but the rules changed right in the middle of the game. He was the cog in the wheel. He knew how the presidential power game went, you know, and he played his role. I think he did some good things, believe it or not, with society at that period of time. But unfortunately, the war machine had already taken over, and he was a cog in the wheel of the war machine. In fact, they didn't even want him to pull out of Vietnam when he ended up doing it in 1972. So, you know, I mean, and there he opens up China and has a détente with Russia. So that's something that they don't like either, in my opinion. That's where they start to turn against him. And, you know, it's interesting. They studied him and his profile, and what they realized is that his key kind of Achilles heel was his paranoia. And that's how they played that up. And that's how we get to the tapes and all the rest of it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Going deep here tonight with your questions. I'm going to insert a couple of things here I wasn't able to get to about Stavros Niarchos. Now, you remember earlier I mentioned this kind of strange artist who had worked in psychological operations during World War II for the government and the military, and he was this incredible, you know, kind of transhumanist artist and a remarkable artist. There's no question about it. I marvel at the stuff that he was doing, but I wonder what the spirit of the whole thing was behind it and who was promoting the work that he was doing. Interestingly enough, one of the things I mentioned is that Stavros Niarchos was somebody who, when he heard he was going to be on the cover of Time magazine, requested this guy. Now, take a look at the Time magazine cover that he got, because it includes, and remember that this guy has working for him the German rocket scientist Muck, who wrote this incredible detailed book on Atlantis. And then this guy names his yacht Atlantis, and then look at the interesting Atlantean. Oh, that's Poseidon, and then Poseidon's daughters right there on the Time magazine covers. Are these people connected with that Atlantis search cult, Belial, Emilius? You bet. And you bet that this is something that's passed down through those groups. And when we get to people like Marvin Minsky and Epstein trying to blackmail Cousteau and things like that, there's a long legacy of this Hot Zone piece. But here's what's even stranger. The same artist, 1 year after doing this, will also do a portrait of Jacques Cousteau, Mr. Atlantis himself. And that's the image he does of Cousteau. So there's a very interesting kind of art as information component on that one that I thought we'd get to. What I'm going to do, since time is prohibitive, is I'm going to get to an Onassis Stavros episode on its own that will do it. And there's a lot there to work with. So yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Stephen Huey wants to know, so does DJ think those underwater pyramids are Atlantis?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's a culture. I think Poseidia survived a little bit after Atlantis. And I think that the final move, the final takedown took place where the Bermuda Triangle is. And I think that it pulled everything down in its wake. And the whole area of the Hot Zone, you know, Egerton Sykes, who's a British intelligence official, top expert on Atlantis, left his whole legacy to the CAYCE Foundation. We've mentioned it many times in this program. He said that they're all the intelligence services from Russia, China, South America, the US, they're all aware of the ruins in the hot zone. So, and he said that in his own investigations, he had found an ISIS temple right in the Bahamas, but he wasn't going to give the location. So this is interesting because once in a while you see those Google Earth people and they'd be like, there's a pyramid that showed up there and it's gone. But they saw it for a little while. Something had happened, maybe a hurricane or something, had moved things enough so where it could be visible. Interestingly enough, there's a whole AUTEC piece to this as well, because of course AUTEC, there's so many UFO sightings around AUTEC. And AUTEC is the underwater Area 51 that operates from the US government off the coast of Andros Island. One of the things that happened there was that a whistleblower came forward who had worked for them back in the 80s. And he went on a program and he was discussing it. And he said what came up out of the water on a radar signal was a continent, a landmass. And he said, oh, there's this whole landmass. And he got his superiors in, they looked at it and they said, okay, what's going on here? Now, the landmass was there for a while and then disappeared. Then later on, 2 days later, the same thing happens. A landmass shows up on the radar and they send out to investigate it. This whole piece about what AUTEC is doing down there is because there seems to be something that phases in and out in that area. And this is related to some of the apotheum discussion that we've had on this program. When you follow the hot zone activity, what you're looking at is something that resides simultaneously in the physical world and somewhere else. So we see physical effects of it. That's the whole Bermuda Triangle piece. That's the whole apotheum thing. Whatever technology that the Atlanteans were using was kept after the fact. This is the upshot. But it was kept in those mystery skulls. And, one of the things is the foundation of the show. They kept it through X-steganography, and you see that throughout history. In the 20th century, the X-steganography got a big upgrade because I think it came through Vannevar Bush, but I'm sure it wasn't just one sole individual. They decided to use the X-steganography to identify the advanced technology that we were dealing with. So you could move something through a government agency and you could tell a certain group of people about it. They could see the steganography and know that that was the program. So this is how the advanced technology was moved around without everybody being in on it or everybody knowing about it. And we see so much of it. We're sitting on what? SpaceX? What is he trying to do? He's trying to make the everything app. It's the X app, right? It's X is everything. All the communication on the space side with Bezos and with Elon Musk, that's all X-steganography. And so it comes out of this exact same thing that we're talking about. They're aware of it, and we've made it public. And so many of the things that we've made public now, you see coming out in weird kind of bastardized forms. And, someone sent me this clip, and it was some kind of documentary. Elizondo was in it. And there was this guy, sort of, they were playing up the whole computer geek thing. I think they actually dressed him as a computer geek. And he was talking about, the guy who was interviewing him said, I hear you've discovered some fantastic things about John Trump and Vannevar Bush. And he's like, yes, in my research, I've learned that Vannevar Bush, he was the mentor to John Trump. Hello, X Series 2017, right? So these things, I want all the information around these subjects to come out. But what I'm seeing on a regular basis, on a very high level, where they're paying things off, like the Rogan show and all this stuff, from that level all the way through to mainstream media and all the rest of it, we have to understand that all the research that these other people have done are going to be packaged into little fast food hamburger packages for people to absorb false disclosure using the real facts. So we have to separate solid knowledge and we have to cite actual sources. Whenever I talk about anything, who am I referring to? I'm going to refer to Joseph Farrell. I'm going to refer to the mystery schools, T.T. Brown, the work of G.G. Young. Like, it's going to be cited. So when we see these things coming out and they're pretending, oh yeah, like Ryan Graves is the first Navy pilot to come on the record about UFOs. I didn't even read the article that he's in. I'm going to do that.
Do it.
While I'm thinking of it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going to take more of your questions. You've been really patient. I appreciate it. But okay, Ryan Graves, nice guy and everything else, and I'm sure he's a great pilot. Nothing wrong with him. What I'm saying is watch how it moves, okay? Leslie Kean was behind the phony story in the New York Times, which gave us the UFO threat thing. Lou Elizondo, ex-Pentagon, which he was not ex-anything because he was still working for them. So all that phoniness, to the Stars Academy, $50 million, CIA people jumping up and down and saying they were abducted. All that nonsense came directly through this door of Leslie Kean in that article. Leslie Kean touted around Ryan Graves as this Navy pilot. That's where he's coming through. And Graves, when he's talking about seeing these UFOs, as I've pointed out, what he makes note of is that the UFOs themselves are showing up during training exercises. My instant impression was, Lockheed Martin want to play with this guy's marbles and then maybe, have him go out and do these interview shows about their technology. So, oh yeah, you're seeing a tic-tac. So let's get a little bit of this. It's a Politico article. I'm going to see if I can read just a few points of it. The author of the article is Brian Bender, who did what? He's the one who put out and supported the New York Times article. He was the source now to confirm that what they were saying was real. So, the editors were like, okay, let's roll. Well, it turned out that none of the stuff was true, but then he runs from the hill, and now his new op is Ryan Graves. All right, let's read this. The country's largest organization of technical experts has concluded the recent incursions pose a safety hazard to aircraft. This is the new thing. It's not a threat. It's a safety hazard. All right. America's top aerospace engineers and scientists are joining forces to protect us from UFOs. The country's largest organization of government and private sector technical experts is launching a project to study unidentified aerial phenomena after concluding that recent incursions of mysterious crafts pose a safety hazard to military. All right, so we had the threat, right? That was they're going to come in, they can do so much to us. Now it's like, oh, it's a safety hazard. They could crash into us. A UFO is not crashed into a plane. All right. And the whole idea behind their advanced technology is they know how to get out of the way and all the rest of it. We probably look, like we're on a tricycle by comparison. Okay. The American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, which includes among its members the country's largest defense and NASA contractors, has established 3 committees to study the technology, how incursions affect pilot and passenger safety. We're stepping into new territory, said Ryan Graves, a former Navy fighter pilot and defense contractor who's co-chairing AIAA's Unidentified Aerospace Phenomena Community of Interest. AIAA, who does that include? Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, you name it. It's the aerospace defense contractors. He's in the party and he's a defense contractor. He's joined by Ravi Kaparapu, a planetary scientist at NASA who's studying the potential habitability of Earth-like planets. This topic's not for everyone, added Graves, who came forward with his own experience with UFOs hovering over his F-818 Hornet fighter jet in 2014 and 15. Now look, they could be using this guy, or they could have said, we're going to use you in this operation, and if you do it, we'll grant your defense contractor all this position. So these things don't look good to me. And then he shows up on the Joe Rogan show. Like, I feel like I'm watching a fraudulent pageant going on. And I feel like everyone's supposed to be in on it because they want disclosure and all the rest of it, but instead what we're looking at is people profiting and through very shady groups. The defense contractors are some of the most secretive of all. They triple bill the government. The government's corrupt enough. So, what are we looking at here, really? the UFO thing needs to come, somebody needs to remind these people who are reporting on this stuff that you're being manipulated by the CIA and by defense contractors. This thing is going to hell in a handbasket. There's no truth left in this. And then you roll this guy out, and now what is he doing? He's sitting as a defense contractor getting contracts for this thing. It sounds like a bribe. So, this is the nature of where we're finding ourselves. And the person who's promoting it, who's writing the article and just, doing his job for Politico, is the same guy who cut loose with the TTSA story and was on their show Unidentified with Elizondo. There's what happens to, let's say you're investigating something, you need a certain amount of objectivity. And if they're paying you and putting you in shows and stuff like that, you're not going to have it. That's just the way it is. So, if somebody legitimately calls for your services to be a speaker or something and you get paid for it, that's one thing. But if you're studying something and it's in your best interest that they're not lying, then it's a problem, because that compromises everything that you would do as a journalist. You can't do it. I can't investigate my employer while they're giving me bonuses, right? It's just not going to work. So just a couple of quick things on the tail end of this. Let's see what we're doing for time. Okay. This topic is not for everyone, added Graves, who came forward with his own experience. It's not about forcing people to look into this if they're not ready. People have to come to terms with it. But he said that scores of members of the 30,000 strong AIAA, drawn from aerospace contractors, government agencies, think tanks, and startups, think tanks who are studying how the UFO threat could grant them emergency powers, have already signed on to the effort and are super excited about what we are doing. There's more than we can handle right now, he said, describing those who've come forward to lend their expertise as running the gambit of people who have 30 plus years at NASA to non-traditional members of the tech community. We have to take bits from a lot of different things and combine them together in new ways to get answers. Okay. The establishment this summer of the all-expansive, all-domain anomaly resolution office, they're already getting rid of that. And this is the other thing. There's so much more, but that's in Politico. You can read the rest of the article, and it's more, pumping up this whole thing about this UFO initiative. What I really want to point out here is what we're looking at is consolidation, and now you have different competitors for that consolidation, but they're operating on the false premise again, because the actual information resides where? It resides with X-Protect. That's the real information regarding the UFO file. So this stuff, I saw something on a training exercise that gets the worldwide attention, right? And then they pay a guy $300 million, a comedian, to be a podcast poster boy for this stuff. So you're not going to get, you'll get entertainment that way, and you'll get a kind of a dog and pony show about disclosure. How about the real thing? What happens to the real thing? Well, the actual culture is at a point where even JFK's records from 60 years ago can't be let out because it would damage the CIA's credibility. Going back to the 9/11 thing, Leslie Kean is interesting too, because her uncle is Governor Thomas Kean. And what did he head up? He headed up the 9/11 Commission, So there's too much political overlap around this subject without a real journalistic voice that is respectfully but truthfully calling him out. And, everyone, I think I'm not understanding in fundamental terms how a field can let people through without any kind of background. So the CIA comes into the UFO field, they run these operations, and then there's no one in the field to challenge the things that they're putting forward. So the next step is that on this higher side, the establishment picks up the market share of the subject that people are genuinely interested in. And then they do what? They collaborate with the intelligence agencies and the defense contractors to give you a lot of junk. So there has to be a much better way to do this. And in my opinion, you know, I'm working on it through dark journalism. That's how I'm going to do it. But I would demand of people who say they're working along these lines, or any journalist, to demand what these people, what their connections are, who they are connected to, which politicians they are connected to. How are all these politicians suddenly UFO experts, for example? You know, I go through it with Ruben Galejo, Kirsten Gillibrand, Marco Rubio. Like, where did all their interest in UFOs come from? Why are they being spotted out there? Are they being told this thing is coming in? You know, there's this emergency powers thing coming in, all this money's behind it. You can be a piece of it if you play your cards right and start talking about this thing early. We need to get to the bottom of those things to get a real vital research community going around it, because otherwise they're very well funded, you know, entrainment hypnosis machine. And there's a lot of brainwashing in that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep, deep tonight here in X Series 136 on the Atlantis AUTEC and Automatons. We're taking your questions. I'm going to go back to your questions now. Rant over.
That's great. I was thinking about the truther movement and how they weaponize that term, and that citizens,
yes,
you know, what is wrong with wanting truth and accountability from our government? We're taxpayers. They, you know, theoretically, they're using our tax dollars to pay for all of this, their salaries. Isn't that, we need to hold their feet to the fire. We have to. Catherine Austin Fitz is always talking about us taking responsibility for our part in the whole thing, right?
It is. And their whole thing is shut up, peasant, shut up, slave. You know, that's really what it comes down to. And we're the authorities. You know, we'll tell you what to take medically. We'll tell you what's a threat in the sky that you know nothing about. So, you know, we're at a pivotal point. You know, it's where there has to be some kind of declaration of independence, you know. And it almost is like, I mean, it's so beyond over the top, right? We've seen it with governments. We've seen the consolidation of governments. We've seen them talk like, you know, laws and the Constitution don't even exist. So we're in a strange place. And I think it is by holding up the reality like a mirror that, you know, we come to a much better understanding. And, you know, those people are living in a fog, and so many of them, I think, have overplayed their hands, you know, from Fauci on one side to Biden and the Ukraine and all these different things. And it feels to me like the nature of this thing is not stable. You know, that the things that they've put in place, that they made a really big gamble and that it's not going to pay off. But that's pretty ugly, you know, so they'll almost do anything not to suffer the repercussions. That's why things like a peace process, like nuclear accountability, like make sure, you know, that we know what's going on over there in relation to Ukraine and Russia. These are crucial, I think, areas for our own future. And, you know, other things, the accountability in government, the overreach, you know, who got paid off during this whole op that we've been under for the last 3 years? Like, you know, we know that Amazon added incredible billions to what they were doing. You know, Zoom, Bezos, SpaceX, and all the rest of it. You know, how are these people profiting off such misery? You know, it's unconscionable. But now let's get to the point, and we have a lot of people who are doing this. One of them I was just looking at, which is RFK's quote here. He says, bioweapons expert Francis Boyle said the Biden administration's new $88 billion national biodefense strategy signals the U.S. is expanding its biological warfare industry for the purpose of waging biological warfare. That's his article and his tweet on Children's Health Defense. You can look that story up. But, you know, these are people sounding the alarm that, you know, these things are going far outside of the protocols that we've developed as a society of decency, of oversight, and all the rest. And it's going to be, a regular process of reestablishing real government. The continuity of government piece also, I think it's almost like we need national education, especially in America, about COG. And I always refer and cite the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott when it comes to it. But that system eliminates the Constitution. So if that's what they're, really kind of revving up for, then our own knowledge and understanding about who's holding the buttons for the COG group, which is supposed to take over under an emergency situation. I've pointed out that the people who are at the buttons right now have very, very deep UFO connections. And that's troubling, considering the weird thing that the media is doing with the government and intelligence agencies' help in relation to this. Yes.
S23 says AI is running the world's script. It would make sense. It definitely feels as though there is something inhuman that is controlling things.
Yes.
It's not just the egos of these people. It's also why and how they run an op for a day and then pull it. They're constantly adjusting as they're getting data in real time. Is this going to work? Isn't it? It's about hurting us and mind controlling us.
Oh, that's really true. My reflecting back to this Atlantis period, there's an interesting thing that takes place. We start to understand where we are a little bit better. And so this society, we've always had different types of evils, right? From Rome and all these different kind of authoritarian societies over time. But we had arrived at a place, I would say, by the 1980s of, having grown as a culture and created a number of things. I think if we look back and we go back and look at these periods, we looked at things like, World War II and Nazism is this absolute low. And yet we see people embracing on the leadership level all the same type of language, but coming through this kind of liberal humanist filter, very much like how we were warned in Brave New World. So if we can get a handle on the nature of humanity and the nature of what informs the background of the people that are involved with this. So if they're aware on a mystery school level of things like Atlantis, and if they think, oh, you know what, we almost achieved it. We almost, achieved this Superman ability at that period. We can do this if we re-engage ourselves with the Belial energy, which is what Epstein and Maxwell as a surface level were involved with. All those scientists were also involved, but they were targeting scientists on somebody's behalf. When we look at that, as far out as it sounds, the Atlantis piece becomes very important, not only for humanity's collective memory, but it might actually be a useful tool to understand how the people who are influencing society see the world. If we can look through them to the things that they believe, then we can be looking at an entirely different viewpoint as a culture. And this is important because, in my own personal experience, looking at the mystery school information, I absolutely believe in what's been laid down about Atlantis and the history that we had there and through the CAYCE work. But even if you didn't, you'd learn a great deal about the people who are operating our world today by the fact of understanding this is their belief system. So even if you didn't really think all of this had taken place, etc., you'd learn a great deal about, because they certainly understand it and believe it. But I can tell you that so many groups on the mystery school side put that information together for a reason, and they highlighted Atlantis for a reason, because they didn't have to, but it's a central tenet core in theosophy, anthroposophy, It's in the Gurdjieff work, and it reaches its best height in Casey's work in terms of the mystical vision of the whole thing. So, so many incredible scientists know that this took place as well. So, we're looking at a kind of humanity re-education, that we need to arise and kind of lift up to that moment. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to take a few more of your questions here, and I will, as a payback, because there were so many things to get to tonight, I will do a Stavros Onassis show showing the very unusual crisscross of them and their kind of worldwide water empire and how that relates to the Hot Zone. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. That's the thing that keeps us in touch through the incredible censorship that we've been watching, just over the top. And this is a really simple way for us to keep in touch. And also it gives you the ability to find out about these things, because you're not going to be hearing, I don't always say that you can rely on notifications when it comes to some of the video platforms. All right.
Ogun 5, has Daniel alluded to what his documentary will be about yet?
There's two. And you can probably guess what they are, but I'm going to announce them before the year's over. So that'll probably make it easier. But the UFO file is in there, and the Hot Zone's also in there. Yes.
Okay, so let's just back up a little bit on Atlantis. Okay, Jay Vanderbest, Atlantis, not a continent, but a big island and a chain of islands. Kevin Bauman says, could Atlantis be the entire Earth? John Guerra says, what if Atlantis was a group of islands as described? And yes, it's plausible that it went underwater when a solar event happened, or a comet, as Randall Carlson is hypothesizing with a Younger Dryas event.
Yeah.
It was an empire.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
we have to think about the island empire of Britain, right? Of Great Britain. And so they had offshoots in India and...
Exactly. There's no question about it. However, I think what you need to be aware of is, Casey talks about this. This is crucial. 50,722 BC. All of the nations of the earth get together in Atlantis and decide we need to take out the large beasts, presumably dinosaurs, that are overrunning the earth. Now, what's interesting is, scientists have the dinosaurs checking out 65 million BC. How do you get Casey saying 50,722 BC? They're looking at this. Either he's wrong, or we have a totally wrong idea about what took the dinosaurs out. So, and there's actually a reading that I have in relation to this, but let me say this. I'm going to read this, actually. I was lucky enough to have it right here. The entity was among those who were of the children of the law of one, the Aemilius group, in the Atlantean period. The entity was the timekeeper for those who were called things. Remember the things? Or the servants or the workers of the peoples. The entity then was among those who were of that group who gathered to rid the earth of the enormous animals which overran the earth. But ice, the entity found, nature, God, changed the poles, and the animals were destroyed, though man attempted it in that activity at the meetings. Eventually, they were wiped out by a pole shift. The Casey readings explain that the Atlanteans decided, using explosives created by focused rays of the two-eye crystal, to kill the large animals. The explosions released natural gases apparently from the ocean bottom that created a catastrophic series of events. These events may have led to the shift in the Earth's poles. What happens is they use the Atlantean power station to do this, and something goes wrong. So it's almost like a nuclear accident, and it splits Atlantis into 3 islands. The 3 islands are Arion, Poseidia, and Og. Og is the portion near South America. Poseidia is the portion in the Bahamas, and Arion is Spain and that Ireland and that whole area. So 50,722 BC, Atlantis becomes 3 big islands. And that's what we're looking at there. It's something on the size. Remember, all the main sources, even Plato, on one side, he's saying it's beyond the Straits of Hercules. So it's in the Atlantic Ocean. And what we have is all the mystery school people saying on one side it's on the Mediterranean, on the other side it's the Gulf of Mexico. It's in the whole Atlantic, but it becomes 3 islands. Later, it looks like, and the Sargasso Sea, supposedly, which is incredibly hard to navigate, that becomes a piece of Atlantis that goes down. The final piece that goes down is that section that we were talking about earlier, which is referred to as Murius by the Celts. When people say that Atlantis was the whole world, no, I think that there were very primitive groups and groups of humanity. And I think that the Atlanteans were unusually gifted with scientific expertise and spiritual expertise and psychic abilities. As a matter of fact, I think one of the interesting and most fascinating pieces about looking back at Atlantis is that what we're seeing is the reason it's so fantastic is mankind, humanity, had achieved a level that we haven't seen before. And we had achieved it somehow in this incredible flow of cosmic connection, spiritual connection, and physical causality. And that goes wrong at a certain point in this kind of balancing act and battle between the Aemilius group and the Belial group. The Belial group gets the upper hand, and the Aemilius group basically retreats to Poseidia, and then the Belial group ultimately, they win, but they are blown out. And the Aemilius group has pocketed the knowledge in different parts of the world. Casey said all 3 of the places have the same information, and that information's in Yucatan. It's in the sunken portion off the coast of Bimini in a temple of Poseidia, which is rising with that landmass. And it's under there's a pyramid underground in Egypt that is connected. This is an interesting thing because if you really read those readings, it doesn't say that the Hall of Records is under the Sphinx. It says that the opening is under the Sphinx right paw, and it leads to basically something that goes between the Sphinx and the river. That's a pyramid underground. That's what his reading about the Hall of Records says, that the entrance is under that right paw. So it is quite fascinating, but more and more, when you look at the world and the nature of the world and the situation that we find ourselves in, can't you imagine us finding the Hall of Records in this period and learning about that history? It seems like this is at least the testing period for that. And I'm sure that these groups are aware of that, the groups that are trying to kind of harvest humanity, and that there's a battle going on here between our consciousness rising up and this thing trying to maintain control. And that's getting very heated. Yes.
Najat Madri, could the automatons have built the pyramids and moved all the great monoliths that today's machinery can't move today?
That's a really excellent point. Well, what happens with the automatons after they're perfected? That is, they started off as cyborgs, but Rata creates this whole program of the Temple Beautiful to make them shed the cyborg parts, the animal mixture. What happens then? They might become kind of almost superhuman in a sense. Or there could be also groups that didn't go through that who are mutant dynasty. So there's a wonderful thing that Gigi suggested in our last interview, which had something to do with the idea that, some of the the UFO sightings, I think if you go back to a case, particularly in Lexington, Kentucky, which is real close to where Casey grew up, Actually, it was this sighting, I think I found out, was only 25 miles away. But this was an encounter that a family had in the 1950s with a group of aliens that come down, and they have like webbed hands, and they really look like the kind of gargoyle aliens. And they basically have a huge, they harass this family, and the family takes off to the city and gets the sheriff and all the rest of it. And everyone around there is seeing this UFO.
Where is this one?
This is in Lexington, Kentucky.
Oh, right. It's the one there on the roofs.
Oh, no, it's not like, it's Hopkinsville.
Mm-hmm.
That's where it is. Yeah, they're on the roofs, and they mess.
They're reaching down.
Right. They mess with the hair of the people, and that's the first notice that something weird is going on. And then all of a sudden, but if you look at those aliens, they look very different than like grays or anything else. They look kind of like, sort of like little monsters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a few cases like that. The Flatwoods monster is also
I love the Flatwoods monster.
Has that kind of feel to it. But when I think about that, you wonder, did that group, they were scientifically advanced. Maybe they went on their own kind of curve. You don't know. But what I think is interesting is there's almost in the CAYCE readings a sadness about the automatons. It's like they're so regarded as such slaves. And in the priesthood, Rata gets pushback because the priesthood says they shouldn't be allowed to share in, spiritual light. They shouldn't be allowed to seek spiritual light because of the way that it's understood that they were made, the same way that we would have a problem if something was made that was half clone, let's say, and half robot, which we know that they're working on this stuff. What becomes the nature of the sole inhabitant? And this is how the AI question runs directly back to the Atlantis parallel. These are the types of things that I think are almost timeless in the CAYCE readings, because I can easily imagine this same situation arising and us having the very same feelings that, upon seeing society just say, well, these things are just, sure, they have some human in them, but they're robots, so they can't have any soul. There's a weird echo back there with that story. And so it's always, I thought, been very appropriate for this century. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions. You've been an outstanding ideas room tonight, and we have gone deep on the Atlantean AUTEC Automaton mystery. And we're going to have something of a part 2 with this. We have some incredible shows, by the way, coming up for you in November. And we'll do something special and spooky for Halloween too. Yes.
All right, Najat Madri again. Follow-up question. Why do they need to create automatons today when it didn't work the first time? I think it did work. That's the scary thing. It worked very well for them, probably for a long time.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think that the Belial Ahriman piece is in communication with them. I think that Steiner describes Ahriman as a dark astral force, and then you think about the Belial piece. Well, it seems to me that this is something that is on humanity's trail, and there are groups inside those scientific communities who think that they can, through CERN and other types of things, that they can achieve communication, communion with these things. And I'm sure in different types of rituals and things of that nature, they certainly have. But I think that the hunt after the Hot Zone and the Cult of Belial piece about bringing these scientists down. Remember, we also have Maxwell bringing down these incredible scientists in the Atlantis submarine, right? I mean, how obvious is this getting? It is quite fascinating. Those are the facts on the ground. We don't even have to guess about, we've done the episodes on Ghislaine and Janet Atlantis and all the rest of it. We know that they're using this. We just don't know the level of their own knowledge about it, or how plugged in, how much information they're being given by the secret societies about the Atlantean piece, but it seems to me that whole thing is a Belial cult. And that's where we get some real answers. You know, the sex slave thing, the sex trafficking thing, this is the tragedy of how those people operate. But it is always the glare of the story on top. What's driving them? Why are they using Atlantis as their theme? You know, what is it that's going on beneath the surface? You know, for all their incredible sex trafficking stuff, why are they targeting Alexandra Cousteau? Doesn't add up with that at all. So we can see there's another level of the story there. That's the piece I think to keep an eye on, because you get real answers that way. Yes.
You know, this is such an interesting answer. So Jay Vanderbest said, Armon, like most demons, does not learn well. I think that you can extrapolate that and just say, you know, demon's gonna demon, right? You know, it's kind of, you know, the darkness. This is we live in a zone of dark and light, and right. So there are two forces, and just like spiritually, we can get lost, but that desire for reconnection to God, to Source, is always there, and as well as the temptation away from God, right? But is that the reason why this will come up again, and that we have to know, as Sun Tzu said, right? Know your enemy. That this is a force that wants to take you away from your own spirituality, from your own evolution, personal evolution, right? We've seen this in so many Star Treks, right? So the people, they get to a point where they're kind of evolved technologically, and then they devolve, right?
That's true. Well, somebody was getting some very interesting. I happen to think that the Steiner work informed on a deep level. It's obvious with certain shows like Twin Peaks, but I think it deeply informed some of the mythological clashes in the Star Trek series. So that's a really good point. And in science fiction generally, look, I think what it comes down to, you know, what you were talking about is interesting, because it reminds me that people go over the top over all the time, right? And, you know, so why wouldn't they do this? Why wouldn't they do that? There's a kind of a madness that's associated with greed, and a madness that's associated with different things that you could analyze psychologically, and you can analyze from an esoteric perspective. So that's the humanity level. The thing that might be gaining from the confusion of humanity is different, and we can't consider it the same way. We can't attribute it and say, like, why does an Ahriman do this or do that? Because it's a thing. It's like a you know, you're no longer talking about an individual, so you can see that the motivations of it are like tentacles in a sense. And so you have to almost go into a primal way of looking at that to understand how it's motivated. And it may be, you know, there's a psychological condition for somebody who wants to go over a cliff, you know. That's, you know, one way of understanding it. It's an impulse. It's a kind of madness in that sense. Yes.
Thank you. That's thank you for saying the word impulse, right? This is a plane. This is a dimension where we have two impulses, right? The impulse for return to source, right? And to move away from source. And that ultimately, and this, so beyond good and evil, it's just those two instincts or impulses, and they're fighting within each of us. Sort of, it's on the macrocosmic and the microcosmic level. And we have to acknowledge each one of us is dealing with that. We just happen to be now in a very extreme phase of this.
Yeah, I happen to think that just like with World War II, the timing had to be just so. And, you know, the things that people lived through. I mean, this is within the last, 80 years of our own culture. So they lived through that, the insanity of that. And finally, the ultimate insanity, dropping an atomic bomb. You know, So the capability of madness driving a culture is there, and it has to do, it resides somewhere in the mind. And I think that's what we're looking at. All right, one last question, Miss Olivia. And you're up.
Okay, Karen Carpenter, are the automatons ripe ground for walk-ins or lower entities?
Well, I think that they have no will of their own, is the way that they're described. So they're like robots in that sense. So it's like making a clone who's a cyborg and then giving it a set of instructions and not giving it any free will. So it's playing God, and, you know, this idea that they were doing the work, you know, in the fields and all the rest of it, and that they had timekeepers who were the natives and stuff. You know, that's a that's a very human kind of situation, isn't it? We've seen that before, when whole groups are sent out to do the labor and they have a very small controlling elite financial force profiting from it. But I think these things have played out through history. It's like a pattern. But I think what's strange when you get to the things is that they're interfered with. And it's the nature of the automaton that it needs to be set free. This is what Rata was about. He was trying to put them through this process and then purify them, give them a new endocrine system so that they could be a whole being. But it's a chapter, I think, that we're on the cusp of repeating. It's a mistake, a large-scale mistake. So we've heard these things before, like, you know, humanity will destroy itself, you know, this kind of thing. And yet humanity destroyed everything back in the Atlantean times and rebuilt from it. So it seems like there's an unconscious memory in there to prevent us from doing that if we're aroused to the image of what happened. And one of the things certainly that would be back there in the subconscious record, the Akashic record of our collective mind, would be the automatons. There's no question about it. And with that, everyone, I think that we will call it a night. Miss Olivia.
I'm going to just throw one. It's not really a question, it's a comment, but it's a really great. Everybody is so smart in the ideas room. Class Action TS Club says, we have been invaded by malevolent ET, AI, by a mind virus to take over our consciousness and bring us into their hive mind. They are truly insane with this mind virus and want to disconnect the organic.
Interesting.
That resonates with me.
It does. I'll leave you with a Casey quote that is about that period and the things that were happening there. This is interesting. Remember when he was talking about Emilius realizing, oh, when our consciousness, we can go to any part of the universe. Now we can also do it, wave of my hand, physically. Here's a ship to travel in. Well, he's also talking about the things that had happened. And he said, through the uses not only of those recently rediscovered gases, a lot of things were being rediscovered that, you know, uranium, the use of uranium, all these different things. So through the use of electrical and aeronautic formations and the breaking up of the atomic forces to produce impelling forces to those means and modes of transposition or of travel, or of lifting large weights, or of changing the faces and forces of nature itself. This is what the Atlanteans excelled in. But with these transposition, with these changes that came in as personalities, we find these as the sons of the creative forces as manifest in their experiences, looking upon those changed forms, or the daughters of men, and there crept in those pollutions, or polluting themselves with those mixtures that brought contempt, hatred, bloodshed, and those that build for desires of self without respect of others' freedom and others' wishes. And there began then, in the latter portion of this period of development, that brought about those of dissenting and divisions among the people and the lands, with the attempts of those still in power through those lineages of the pure that had kept themselves intact as of the abilities of forces as were manifested in their activities. These builded rather those things that attempted to draw back those people through first various changes or seasons that came about in the latter portion of the experience of Emilius. This was the first establishing of the altars upon which the sacrifices of the field of the forests and those that were satisfied the desires of the physical body were builded. So it's very interesting. What happens is, what he's describing there, which I think is fascinating, is that at some point, the whole setup was spiritually pure, but there's a group that makes a different type of human, which is how we eventually get these automatons, and that somehow there's an intermix. It's like the corruption of the DNA very early, and so there's the attempt to purge this thing, and that's where sacred altars and this whole piece comes about. That to me is absolutely fascinating. And, when you go in, you start to resonate with the CAYCE work, you can start to, it opens up, I would say, that level of history, and it's mind-boggling level of history. And with that history, everyone.
Are you sure you want to end?
Yes.
Okay. Are you sure? Are you really sure?
Wow, you're good.
I have one really great mega question that I really wanted to get to. Okay.
Of course.
So Jorge M. There are a multitude of UFO angles. L.A. Marzulli, Project Camelot, Law of One, people at East SETI, the ex-defense people, the Atlanteans. How do we know which one is on point unless there are a multitude of UFOs? How would you advise people when they go about researching these to find the truth? Because no one really knows the truth, and we have to be very wary when somebody says they claim that they know the truth, right? All of us are in the process of searching. So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, you have to go with what resonates with you. No one's going to be able to tell you how to do it. But I think that things that bring in the idea that, like, for example, if you hear, oh, aliens are demons, they're that whole thing, you're going to have to prove that. Which aliens are you talking about? Any aliens? So I'm not going to subscribe to that type of thing. I would say that there's enough information available to get a foundation around it. Also read through the cases. What happens in cases where, look, there were a series of contactees and abductions, and they run predominantly, if you look at the record, from about the 1930s through to about the 1990s. And then there's a gigantic drop-off. It's almost as if whoever was probing humanity and needed information about humanity wanted to do it before we got into this period where they started to mess with our DNA, where they started to mess with us in different ways, so that the industrialized person was still of value to them. Some people say, well, it was time travelers wanting to preserve the DNA because they see what happens. Look, that's all very interesting. I think that it needs to be considered, especially when we understand the work of people like T.T. Brown. But we have to be, we can deduce certain things from the fact that we're in a period where it seems like UFO abductions are incredibly rare, as if they completed a program. But the question becomes, who was running the program? And what did they get? They got maybe DNA for sure, but something else is involved there. So this, I think, becomes an important conclusion for us, which is what was taking place during the abduction phenomena, and going and looking through those cases. Now, I know people who had abduction experiences when they were younger. And it seems to me that there's a reason that those abductions took place, that wasn't just a random thing, that it seemed like they tuned in, whoever was doing this, on particular types of people. So those things are fascinating, and I would start there rather than worrying about what this person or that person, if they were right. If you go all the way back to, what was the guy on Project Camelot? He had the great voice, and he talked all about, that's our future out there in the stars. Bob Dean, yeah. Bob Dean had a pretty good understanding from his level of what was taking place. So you could say, well, that's interesting, like that Camelot person was a genuine find, great stuff. But, you wind up with a bunch of people who weren't so great, that's for sure. And, some of the worst people, period. So, I would stay away from anything that's marketing driven. If they say, if you pay $777 for enlightenment or something. And also, I think anyone who calls themselves a mystery school, that's a problem too. Because the mystery schools are pretty well hidden, although there are a series of public and private groups that study mystery teachings. So, but real bona fide hardcore schools, those aren't easy to find. And so they're not going to advertise to you. So that would be something I would avoid if somebody were to suggest that, because I know how much of a labyrinth that is. But certainly the whole subject matter is fascinating. Don't worry about, Elizondo, the CIA whistleblower junk, and don't worry about, he actually changed his whole story. Did I tell you about this?
I don't think so.
He has a new thing now where it's like, UFOs are not a national security threat. They're a national security concern. So they've told him, take threat out of your language. You in the ideas room may have achieved this by us focusing on it, and the way that the ideas room has functioned around this. We may have single-handedly changed how the intelligence agencies are trying to promote a threat to humanity. That's the interesting thing that happens when people get together and work on these things. So, if you get somebody who's operating for the CIA trying to create a threat program, and I'm sure they're still at the threat program, but they need to change the language. So now it's a national security concern. Remember when we were talking about the Ryan Graves thing, it was like, oh, they're concerned about national security. There might be a safety issue. It's not a threat. It's a concern and a safety issue. Well, because we exposed the threat. That's why. And, I want to say this, that I think that people like Knapp and Dolan and these types of people promoted the CIA people who were giving us the threat thing. So I'm disappointed in them. I don't think that, that means they're terrible people, but I'm disappointed they gave a platform to the Stars Academy ripoff. And people like Kane and all the rest of it, they created this thing. So I think there should be, a real communication about this, which is, I don't think that people need to fall for that. We're not children, and you can't, we want to know if intelligence people are involved in buttering us up, about disclosure, because we don't want the CIA involved in UFO disclosure. I think it's a pretty fair position, actually. And I think that's something that everyone can shake hands on, actually. And I would agree with the idea that, there's no point in fighting about it. And what's interesting is the CIA are masters at dividing people who agree upon certain things. So what you want is to call it out, So when I do that, I'm doing it as a reporter. I'm saying CIA people got involved in the UFO field, and UFO field researchers let them, which means they let their audience down. So that's important. So those people, you know, they can do what they want, and researchers have to go their own way or whatever. And if they think, well, it's better to be in with the CIA because eventually I'll get some tidbit of knowledge, or they'll give me a show kickback, like, you know, so you're going to choose whatever you want to choose in life, but let's get real about what it is. So don't, you know, don't give me John Ramirez or Jim Semivan, or who's the other one? There's the third one. You know, don't give me those guys as contactees. You know, if the CIA is selling, I'm not buying. So let's move on to real stuff, because the real stuff's so much better than any kind of whirligig weirdo CIA stuff. Hey, those guys are so guilty from assassinating presidents 60 years ago, they can't even give you records. Why are they going to give you the UFO truth? It's not going to happen. So let's get real about it. You know, study the deep state. You'll understand who you're dealing with intelligence agencies. And, you know, it'll make them respect you, because they'll be like, oh, you know, we can't fool these people. Let's move on. Let's not use threat. Let's use safety. And that's important. I think that's important. So that's people also looking out for each other around these very sensitive topics. And a lot of very sensitive people get involved with the topics too. That's what I find. They're some of the most sensitive people. That's one of the characteristics of contactees, interestingly enough. So with all that said, Miss Olivia, super chatters.
Okay. So I'd like to thank Bari, Erica Swenson Elliott, Occult Fan, Gillen Joy R, Gorilla Press, W.C. Ray, Leslie Patton, PJ Doe, Plato Always Knew, happy birthday again, Mark Lane, Karen Carpenter, Shelby Cowan, Wait a Minute 72, Philip Pearson, Friendly Magus, Medley Childress, Eurythmia's Fun, James Cregan, Norman Smith, Brandon Kramer, Jim Sarge 3ID, Bill Neal, Daryl Dathrow, Susan Donahue, Jimbo Khan, Deborah Sloan, Global Atlantis, Luke Walker, Debbie McAdoo, Bob Bindert, Doreen Hewitt, Samuel Dawes, Robert Scott, The Buddhas of Boston Sports, Dorothy Gorska-Tyus, Sarah Jane, Tricky Vicky, Wolfgang McCarthy, and Shazam. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Well, we really appreciate your support, and what an incredible night of questions with everyone. Just great to be here with you. We will see you all next week. You might be looking at a special report or two between now and then, because things are rapidly changing on the ground with all of this stuff. But I would advise you, if you haven't already, to sign up for a newsletter. Make sure you're part of that. I'll do a couple of shout outs before I go. Doyle Wayne. Oh, right. With incredible high tech, I can show their actual. The Nixon info was worth it. Exactly. Jay Vandervest, Erica Swanson Elliott, Nomi B, Kevin Bauman. Great evening. Thank you, sir. It's great to be here with you. You know, whenever the KC work, it's like, it's so mind-boggling. It's so fascinating that to do it with so many thousands of our friends is really great. Thank you, Daniel and Olivia, and everyone. Diana B. Thank you, Diana. It's great to see you. Golden Girl, Walter, Rat Boy Genius. I like Rat Boy Genius. This is good. Deja Vu. Give yourself a hug. I like that. Here we go. DJ is the most interesting man on YouTube. Oh, that takes the cake right there. Thank you very much. Miguel, motor running. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now the motors. It's getting into high gear. Modwiz is out there. It's great to see you, sir. Jay Vandervest. Now you're talking. Liz, Dark Journalist is one of a kind, a good kind, says Modwiz. That's a great one. Modwiz has all kinds of interesting things. I wonder, I haven't seen if Modwiz is doing anything with the channel or whatever, but I've heard him talk. He says some very interesting stuff. Magic Eyes Only on YouTube, Majestic 12, huh? Esoteric Gold. Well, I have to say, with all this stuff about me, that Olivia really knocked it out of the park tonight. Unbelievable. Round of applause, Miss Olivia.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Nicely done. It's interesting. Daniel equals new director of CIA.
Watch out.
Can you imagine? I'd be like, all right, the first thing, the Kennedy records, release those. Action number 1. Second action, every agent has to swear to the Constitution in public. That's 2. 3, all the UFO ex-protect people have to be ousted, and we have to have everything that they have. There we go. That should make things kind of easy.
There's a question I'd like to ask you, which
Yes.
is, okay, that famous thing about we, the public can't handle the truth. And that would be their justification for why they do the things that they do. What can we do to prove to them that we can handle the truth?
Well, that's actually, you know, it's a good thought. It's a good thought to ponder, because this isn't all about just pawning off things on what society does, of course, but so many of the ideas from are about self-improvement. And I think that's, you know, I think Gigi did a show about how to be a good spiritual healer, or how to do spiritual work. And I forget the title of it, but it was absolutely fascinating. And I was thinking to myself, you know, this is interesting, because this is what we're going to need, because it's one thing to go through the battle, but what do you build out of it? You know, and so you're going to learn how to be able to build in the middle of battle. That's important. And I think that that's absolutely crucial. But I 100% agree that it's all on us to make ourselves better people, better parents, better friends, you know.
Better neighbors, better citizens, yeah.
It's important. And, you know, I see a lot of people doing it. I do. And so when we worry about the world and stuff, you know, the world's under a lot of pressure, and it gets a bad rap as well. But I think that one of the greatest ways to bring things around and to change things is to get that discussion going. So, you know, when they go to shut down the conversation, you got them running scared, see? Okay. Organic Veil Radio. We are in a vicious human cycle that we can't seem to break. Interesting. Well, I have to say there's a certain amount of truth to that. Got to do the dishes, says Gurdjieff. That's right. There's a great story I'll share with you about Gurdjieff. These great intellectuals would come to him. You know, Aldous Huxley tells a story, one of the stories about this. And they come in and they expect, you know, they're going to do all this stuff. And Gurdjieff is cooking food. And he's like, all right, you know, like chop some onions or whatever. And they're like, what? You know, I'm not taking part in your kitchen activities. And, you know, this is an interesting thing where mystery school teacher, no mystery school teacher, you know, you're going to be real about all this stuff. Chop wood, carry water. Exactly. Karen Carpenter. Maybe those who can handle the truth are the ones looking for it. Absolutely. Wonderfully. Well said. I couldn't have said it better myself. Esther Taylor. It's great to see you. Jay Vandervest, Modwiz. Doyle Wayne. Fantastic. I know Kate's out there somewhere. Gigi was out there earlier. And we've got more coming up with Gigi soon. Anna Cheever. They live as apparently Ye's current battle. That's great. Yeah. Well, the Ye thing is interesting. There's all kinds of weirdness going on with that. But, you know, I definitely like things operating from the bottom up. Top down has problems. Traveling Riverside Blues Johnson. Hello, sir. It's great to see you. All right. Oh, yeah. That's usually your line. You'll pick out somebody with an incredibly long name. You're like, hello, New Jersey Towing Company in Secaucus, New Jersey. DJ does good things. Thank you, Scarlet Fire. So great, and such great positive feedback. We did the UFO file piece tonight with Atlantis. Really is more Atlantis than UFOs, but, you know, Atlantis needed a break. We are going to be seeing you next Friday, and thank you so much. Great to have so many of you here, and I am looking forward to just digging in on this. And there's going to be some elements from this episode left on the cutting room floor. We will get to them. I'll put together a show around Onassis. I've been wanting to do that. And we will see you all next week.
I'm just going to
And
throw a question out there.
Oh,
It's not for you necessarily, but for everyone to ponder. Rehoboth Farm, who's killing it tonight, said, it's natural to create a God in your image. What should we expect from machines?
I don't know. Frankenstein keeps coming up. It's a weird thing. When I was preparing this, all this, synchronicity around Frankenstein was coming up, and I was thinking, Frankenstein is an updated version of the things, if you think about it. Is this the longest show ever? It's damn close, sir.
I don't want to. I've got energy. I want to keep going.
No, we're done. But I would say this. It's fantastic to be here with everyone. And we will see you all very soon. And, it says end broadcast after all, but Miss Olivia?
Never really ends.
Never really ends. And never let it be forgot that once there was a Camelot. We'll see y'all next week.
God bless everybody.